The cosmos trembled under the weight of prophecy when Hades drew his first breath in the shadowed halls of Mount Olympus, the stronghold of the Titans. Born as the eldest son of Cronus, the Titan lord of time, and Rhea, the mother goddess of fertility in the wild, Hades entered existence during an era when divine power flowed through bloodlines older than memory itself. The year of his birth remains lost to mortal calculation, existing in that primordial time when the Titans ruled supreme over a world still taking shape from the fundamental forces of creation. Cronus had seized control of the universe by castrating his own father, Uranus, with a adamantine sickle forged in the depths of Tartarus. The act had been both liberation and curse, freeing the world from Uranus's oppressive reign while simultaneously binding Cronus to a cycle of violence that would define his rule. The blood of Uranus spilling across the earth had given birth to the Furies, the Giants, and the Meliae nymphs, marking the transition from one cosmic order to another through an act of filial betrayal that would echo through generations. As the firstborn of this new divine generation, Hades emerged into a world where his father's paranoia had already begun to fester like an infected wound. The prophecy that haunted Cronus spoke with the inexorable certainty of fate itself. One of his children would overthrow him just as he had overthrown Uranus. The oracle's words carried the weight of cosmic law, for in the ancient world, prophecies were not mere predictions, but statements of divine will that bent reality to their fulfillment. Gaia herself, the primordial Earth Mother, had delivered this curse with the bitter satisfaction of a grandmother seeking vengeance for her mutilated husband. The psychological torment of this knowledge transformed Cronus from a liberating force into a tyrant consumed by fear. Every cry of his newborn son sent tremors of dread through the Titan's immortal frame. Hades, innocent of any conscious threat, represented the embodiment of his father's deepest terror, the continuation of a pattern that seemed woven into the very fabric of divine existence. The sight of the infant's dark eyes, already holding depths that spoke of hidden wisdom and future power, confirmed Cronus's worst suspicions about the child's potential. Without hesitation or mercy, Cronus seized his eldest son and swallowed him whole. The act was not one of hunger but of desperate self-preservation, a father's attempt to prevent fate by consuming its agent. Hades vanished into the churning darkness of his father's stomach, his existence continuing in a realm of digestive acids and supernatural preservation that defied mortal understanding. The Titan's divine nature prevented true death, but condemned the child to a form of living imprisonment within the very body that had given him life. The experience of existing within Cronus' stomach shaped Hades in ways that would resonate throughout his eternal existence. The environment was one of absolute darkness, where the normal concepts of space and time held no meaning. Digestive processes that would have destroyed mortal flesh instead became a constant, corrosive presence that the young god's immortal form adapted to endure. The walls of his prison pulsed with his father's heartbeat, a rhythmic reminder of the life that continued outside while he remained trapped in this biological dungeon. The isolation might have driven a lesser being to madness, but Hades was no ordinary child. His divine nature, inherited from both the temporal mastery of Cronus and the nurturing strength of Rhea, allowed him to maintain his sanity through sheer force of will. The darkness became his companion rather than his enemy, teaching him to navigate by senses other than sight and to find comfort in solitude that would later serve him well as ruler of the Underworld. The constant presence of death, for he existed in a state between life and dissolution, familiarized him with concepts that his siblings would only encounter much later in their development. As the years passed in the outside world, Hades was joined by his siblings in this grotesque nursery. Poseidon arrived next, his birth accompanied by earthquakes that shook the foundations of Olympus, as Cronus repeated his terrible act of consumption. The future lord of the seas brought with him the sound of crashing waves and the scent of brine, adding new dimensions to their shared prison. His presence provided Hades with his first companion in countless eons. though communication in their current state remained limited to shared consciousness and emotional resonance. Demeter followed, her arrival marked by the sudden withering of crops across the earth as Rhea's grief manifested in the natural world. The goddess of harvest and agriculture brought warmth to their dark confinement, her inherent connection to growing things creating small pockets of life-giving energy within the corrosive environment. Her gentle nature provided a counterbalance to the harsh realities of their imprisonment, though she struggled more than her brothers with the psychological impact of their situation. Hera's consumption came next, the future queen of the gods entering their shared prison with a dignity that remained unbroken despite the circumstances. Her presence brought a sense of order to their chaotic environment, her natural leadership abilities manifesting even in their reduced state. She organized their small community, establishing routines and hierarchies that helped maintain their sanity during the endless passage of time. Finally, Hestia joined them, the future goddess of hearth and home, bringing with her a warmth that was both literal and metaphorical. Her ability to create comfort and security transformed their prison into something approaching a home, though the fundamental horror of their situation remained unchanged. Her presence completed their number, creating a family unit that existed in the most unnatural circumstances imaginable. The psychological dynamics that developed during this period of shared imprisonment would influence their relationships for millennia to come. Hades, as the eldest, naturally assumed a protective role over his younger siblings, his longer experience in their dark world making him their guide and guardian. His relationship with Poseidon developed into one of mutual respect and understanding, both brothers sharing a certain darkness of temperament that set them apart from their more optimistic siblings. The bond between all 5 siblings was forged in suffering and mutual dependence, creating connections that transcended normal family relationships. They learned to communicate without words, to share strength when one grew weak, and to maintain hope when despair threatened to overwhelm them. Hades, in particular, developed an acute sensitivity to the emotional states of others, a skill that would later prove invaluable in his role as judge of the dead. Outside their biological prison, Rhea's anguish grew with each lost child. The mother goddess watched her husband's paranoia consume not only their offspring but his own humanity, transforming the Titan, who had once been her beloved, into a monster driven by fear. Her grief manifested in the natural world through failed harvests, stillborn animals, and a general sense of wrongness that pervaded creation. The other Titans began to question Cronus's fitness to rule, though none dared challenge him directly while he still wielded the power that had overthrown Uranus. When Zeus was born, Rhea had reached the limits of her endurance. The sight of her youngest child glowing with potential power that even exceeded his siblings sparked a desperate plan in the mother's mind. She would not allow this 6th child to join his brothers and sisters in their living tomb. Working in secret with Gaia, who had her own reasons for wanting to see Cronus's downfall, Rhea prepared an elaborate deception that would save at least one of her children from their father's paranoid consumption. The plan required perfect timing and absolute commitment. Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes, disguising it with divine magic to feel and smell like a newborn god. The deception was so complete that even Cronus's supernatural senses could not detect the substitution in his fear-driven haste to consume what he believed to be his newest threat. The stone disappeared into the Titan's gullet, while Zeus was spirited away to Crete, where he would be raised in secret by the nymphs and the goat Amalthea. Years passed as Zeus grew to maturity in his hidden sanctuary, training with weapons forged by the Cyclops and learning the arts of war from the most skilled warriors among the minor gods. His divine nature, unencumbered by the psychological trauma that had shaped his siblings, developed along different lines. Where Hades had learned patience and endurance through suffering, Zeus cultivated boldness and leadership through freedom. Where his brothers and sisters had grown close through shared adversity, Zeus remained somewhat apart, shaped by solitude and the weight of his destined role as liberator. When Zeus finally returned to challenge his father, he came not as a supplicant son, but as a fully grown god of war, wielding lightning bolts crafted by the Cyclops and backed by allies who had grown weary of Cronus's increasingly erratic rule. The confrontation between father and son shook the foundations of reality itself, their battle ranging across dimensions and through realms that existed beyond mortal comprehension. The moment of liberation came not through trickery or poison, as some later accounts would claim, but through Zeus's direct application of divine force. The younger god's lightning, charged with the power of justice and righteous anger, struck Cronus with such intensity that the Titan's body convulsed involuntarily. The violent spasms forced him to regurgitate his swallowed children in reverse order of their consumption, beginning with Hestia and ending with Hades himself. The experience of emergence was traumatic in its own way, a sudden transition from the familiar darkness of imprisonment to the blazing light of freedom. Hades found himself standing on the marble floors of Othrys, his body fully grown but his mind still adjusting to concepts like space and movement that had been theoretical during his captivity. The sight of his siblings, equally disoriented but unmistakably real and separate from himself, provided the first concrete proof that their liberation was genuine rather than another dream born of desperate hope. The reunion between the 6 siblings was marked by a complex mixture of joy, relief, and uncertainty. Years of shared consciousness had created bonds between them that normal families could never experience, yet they were also strangers to each other as individuals. Hades looked upon Zeus with a mixture of gratitude and wariness, recognizing his youngest brother as their saviour, while also noting the fundamental differences in their characters that imprisonment and freedom had created. Poseidon's emergence revealed a god whose power over water and earthquakes had only grown stronger during his captivity. His connection to the primal forces of nature deepened by his long communion with the fundamental elements. His greeting to Hades carried the weight of shared experience, an understanding that needed no words to convey the depth of their bond. The 2 brothers stood apart from the others for a moment, their darker temperaments creating a natural affinity that would influence their future relationship. The dynamics between the 3 brothers, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus, established patterns that would define their interactions throughout eternity. Hades, as the eldest, commanded a certain respect based on his seniority and the wisdom gained through longer suffering. His natural inclination towards solitude and contemplation marked him as different from his more gregarious siblings, though not necessarily inferior. Poseidon, sharing some of Hades' darker aspects while maintaining a more volatile nature, served as a bridge between his brothers' personalities. Zeus, despite being the youngest, had assumed the role of leader through his actions as liberator, but the other brothers' acceptance of this leadership was not automatic or complete. The complex interplay of birth order, shared trauma, and individual achievement created a delicate balance of power that would require careful negotiation to maintain. Hades recognized Zeus's qualities as a leader, while maintaining his own sense of dignity and worth, setting the stage for future discussions about how to divide the responsibilities of ruling their newly liberated cosmos. The liberation from Cronus's stomach marked only the beginning of a conflict that would reshape the fundamental structure of reality itself. Within days of their emergence, the 6 siblings found themselves thrust into preparations for a war that had been brewing since Zeus first challenged their father's authority. The Titans, ancient powers who had ruled since the overthrow of Uranus, would not surrender their dominion without a struggle that would test every aspect of divine power and strategic thinking. Cronus, despite his defeat and the loss of his swallowed children, retained formidable strength and commanded the loyalty of most Titan forces. His brothers Atlas, Menoetius, Prometheus, and Epimetheus controlled vast armies of lesser divine beings, while the Titanesses wielded powers over fundamental aspects of nature that could devastate entire regions. The mountain fortress of Othrys served as their primary stronghold, its peaks reaching into the clouds and its foundations extending deep into the Earth's core, creating a nearly impregnable position from which to launch their campaigns. Zeus established the opposing headquarters on Mount Olympus, a peak that rose even higher than Othrys and commanded strategic views across the entire Mediterranean basin. The mountain's supernatural properties, including its ability to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, provided advantages that the younger gods desperately needed to offset the Titans' superior numbers and experience. From Olympus, Zeus could coordinate attacks across vast distances while maintaining secure communication lines with allied forces throughout the known world. Hades quickly distinguished himself as a military strategist, whose approach differed markedly from his brother's more direct methods. While Zeus favoured overwhelming displays of lightning-powered force, and Poseidon employed massive earthquakes and tsunamis to devastate enemy positions, Hades developed tactics centred on stealth, psychological warfare, and the strategic use of fear. His natural affinity for darkness and solitude, honed during his years of imprisonment, translated into an intuitive understanding of how to exploit enemy weaknesses through surprise attacks and misdirection. The war's early phases saw conventional battles between mass divine armies, with both sides suffering tremendous casualties as immortal beings clashed in combat that reshaped entire landscapes. Mountain ranges crumbled under the impact of Titan hammers, while Zeus's lightning bolts carved new river valleys and created lakes where none had existed before. Poseidon's earthquakes split continents, forcing both armies to constantly adapt their strategies to accommodate rapidly changing geography. The turning point came when Zeus made contact with three groups of primordial beings who had been imprisoned by the Titans during their rise to power: the Cyclopes, the 100-handed ones, and various other earthborn creatures who harboured deep resentments against Cronus's regime. These alliances required delicate negotiations, as the imprisoned beings had little reason to trust any member of the ruling divine hierarchy, regardless of their current conflicts with the Titans. The Cyclops, master craftsmen whose skills surpassed even the most accomplished mortal smiths, occupied a special place in these negotiations. Brontes, Sterapes, and Arges had spent centuries perfecting their techniques while imprisoned in Tartarus, developing new methods for forging weapons that could channel and amplify divine power. Their release from the Underworld prison required Zeus to demonstrate both his military strength and his commitment to a more just form of governance than his father had provided. The weapons the Cyclops created for the three brothers became legendary for their power and their perfect adaptation to each god's individual fighting style. Zeus received his thunderbolts, weapons that could strike with precision across impossible distances while carrying enough force to shatter Titan armour. Poseidon's trident granted him complete control over all bodies of water, allowing him to summon massive waves or create devastating whirlpools that could trap entire enemy formations. For Hades, the Cyclops crafted the Kene, also known as the Helm of Darkness, a piece of headgear that represented the pinnacle of their metallurgical and magical expertise. The helmet appeared to be forged from a metal that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating a surface that seemed to drink in illumination and cast it into some otherworldly void. When worn, the Kene rendered its wearer completely invisible to all forms of perception, including the enhanced senses possessed by divine beings. The helmet's construction incorporated materials gathered from the deepest regions of Tartarus, where darkness existed as a tangible substance rather than merely the absence of light. Veins of this primordial shadow ran through the metal like silver threads, creating patterns that shifted and moved when observed directly. The interior was lined with fabric woven from the dreams of sleeping earth spirits, providing comfort while maintaining the magical properties that made the helmet's invisibility possible. Beyond simple invisibility, The kini granted its wearer the ability to move through shadows as though they were solid pathways, allowing rapid travel across battlefields without detection. Hades could step into the shadow of a tree and emerge from the shadow of a distant mountain, covering miles in seconds while remaining completely undetectable to enemy forces. This mobility transformed him from a conventional warrior into something approaching a force of nature, capable of appearing anywhere on the battlefield at the moment when his intervention would prove most decisive. The psychological impact of the helmet proved as valuable as its practical applications. Titan forces began reporting attacks by an invisible enemy who struck without warning and vanished before retaliation became possible. Sentries found their comrades dead at their posts with no sign of the killer's approach or departure. Supply convoys disappeared entirely, the guards left unconscious with no memory of what had befallen them. The growing paranoia among Titan ranks created an atmosphere of constant fear that undermined their effectiveness in conventional battles. Hades perfected techniques for maximizing the terror his invisible presence could inspire. He learned to manipulate shadows in ways that created disturbing visual effects, causing darkness to move independently of its source, or to take on shapes that suggested lurking threats. His voice, when he chose to speak while invisible, seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, creating the impression that he possessed supernatural abilities beyond mere invisibility. During the siege of the Titan stronghold at Mount Olympus, Hades demonstrated the full potential of his new capabilities. The fortress had withstood months of direct assault by Zeus's forces, its massive walls and magical defences proving impervious to conventional attacks. The defenders, led by Atlas himself, had grown confident in their ability to outlast any siege, knowing that their elevated position and secure supply lines gave them significant advantages over the attacking forces. Hades infiltrated the fortress by travelling through the shadow network that connected all parts of the mountain, emerging within the supposedly impregnable walls without triggering any of the magical alarms that protected the conventional entrances. His first targets were the communication systems that allowed the defenders to coordinate their responses to attacks, severing magical links and eliminating messenger spirits that carried orders between different sections of the fortress. The systematic disruption of Titan communications created confusion that Hades exploited with carefully timed strikes against key defensive positions. Guard posts fell silent one by one as their occupants found themselves facing an enemy they could neither see nor predict. Weapons disappeared from armories, while critical supplies vanished from storage areas, creating shortages that forced the defenders to ration resources they had assumed were secure. Atlas himself became a target for Hades' psychological warfare, the invisible god appearing in the Titan general's private chambers to deliver warnings and threats before vanishing again. The mighty Atlas, who had never known fear in conventional combat, found himself unable to sleep or relax, constantly watching for attacks that might come from any direction at any moment. His growing paranoia affected his decision-making abilities, leading to increasingly erratic orders that further undermined the fortress's defensive capabilities. The final assault on Olympus succeeded largely because of the confusion and demoralization that Hades had sown within the Titan ranks. When Zeus launched his lightning attacks against the outer walls, the defenders found themselves unable to coordinate effective responses. Supply lines had been severed, communication networks had been destroyed, and the psychological impact of months of invisible harassment had broken the morale of troops who had previously considered themselves invincible. Similar tactics proved effective at other major engagements throughout the 10-year conflict. Hades became known among both armies as the Unseen Death, a figure whose reputation grew with each successful mission. His ability to gather intelligence while remaining undetected provided Zeus with detailed information about Titan troop movements, defensive preparations, and strategic planning that proved invaluable in developing effective counter-strategies. The 100-Handed Ones, released from their imprisonment alongside the Cyclops, provided the raw power needed to match the Titans in direct combat. Briareus, Cottus, and Gyges each possessed 50 heads and 100 arms, allowing them to wield multiple weapons simultaneously while maintaining awareness of threats from all directions. Their involvement in the war marked the first time that beings of comparable physical power had opposed the Titans since their original rise to dominance. These primordial giants proved particularly effective against Titan formations that relied on overwhelming force rather than tactical sophistication. Their ability to hurl massive boulders with perfect accuracy while simultaneously engaging multiple opponents in close combat disrupted traditional battle lines and forced both sides to develop new approaches to large-scale warfare. The sight of a 100-handed one advancing across a battlefield, weapons flashing from dozens of arms, while multiple heads coordinated the assault, became one of the war's most terrifying and memorable images. The alliance between the younger gods and these ancient powers created a combined force that could match the Titans in both conventional warfare and supernatural abilities. Zeus's lightning provided long-range artillery support, while Poseidon's earthquakes and tsunamis could reshape battlefields to provide tactical advantages. Hades' invisible strikes eliminated key targets and spread fear among enemy ranks, while the 100-handed ones served as nearly unstoppable shock troops, capable of breaking through even the most formidable defensive positions. The war's conclusion came not through a single decisive battle, but through a series of coordinated campaigns that systematically eliminated Titan strongholds and reduced their ability to maintain organised resistance. The final engagement took place on the plains below Mount Olympus, where the remaining Titan forces made their last stand under the personal leadership of Cronus himself. The battle raged for days, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage through conventional tactics. Cronus had learned to anticipate and counter many of the strategies that had previously given the younger gods their edge, while his own forces had adapted to the psychological pressure of fighting an invisible enemy. The stalemate might have continued indefinitely, if not for a final coordinated assault that utilised every advantage the Allied forces possessed. Zeus coordinated the attack from his position atop Olympus, his lightning bolts providing covering fire for advancing troops while simultaneously targeting Titan command positions. Poseidon created a series of earthquakes that disrupted enemy formations and opened gaps in their defensive lines. The 100-handed ones charged through these openings, their multiple weapons overwhelming individual Titan defenders through sheer volume of attacks. Hades used his invisibility to penetrate deep into the Titan rearguard, targeting Cronus himself in a direct assault that caught the Titan Lord completely unprepared. The confrontation between father and son took place in a sphere of absolute darkness that Hades created using his helmet's power, a realm where the younger god's advantages in stealth and shadow manipulation gave him decisive superiority over his more physically powerful opponent. The defeat of Cronus broke the remaining Titan resistance, as their forces recognized that continued fighting would only result in complete annihilation. The surrender negotiations took place under the shadow of Zeus's lightning and the watchful presence of the 100-handed ones, ensuring that the terms would be dictated entirely by the victorious younger gods. The punishment of the defeated Titans reflected both justice and practical necessity. The most dangerous leaders, including Atlas and Menoetius, received sentences that would prevent any future rebellion, while serving as examples to other potential challengers to the new order. Atlas was condemned to hold up the heavens for eternity, his immense strength turned to the service of cosmic stability. Menoetius was struck down by Zeus's lightning and cast into Tartarus, where his fate served as a warning to any who might consider following his example. The majority of the Titan forces were imprisoned in Tartarus, the deepest region of the Underworld that had previously served as a prison for the Cyclopes and 100-handed ones. The irony of this reversal was not lost on either the victors or the defeated, as those who had once been jailers found themselves confined in the same cells they had used to imprison their enemies. The transition from rulers to prisoners represented a complete reversal of the cosmic order that had existed since the overthrow of Uranus. The 100-handed ones accepted the role of guards over their former captors, their loyalty to Zeus secured through gratitude for their liberation and the promise of honoured positions in the new divine hierarchy. Briareus, Cottus and Gyges established permanent residences in Tartarus, their multiple heads and arms making them ideal sentinels capable of monitoring every corner of the vast prison simultaneously. Their presence ensured that escape attempts would be detected and thwarted before they could develop into serious threats to the stability of the new order. With the war concluded and the Titans safely imprisoned, the three victorious brothers faced the challenge of dividing the cosmos among themselves. The scope of their conquest encompassed not merely the Earth and its immediate surroundings, but multiple dimensions and realms of existence that required careful administration to maintain cosmic balance. The decision-making process needed to account for each brother's individual strengths, preferences, and the practical requirements of governing such vast and diverse territories. The method chosen for this division reflected both the democratic ideals that had motivated their rebellion against Cronus and the recognition that chance might provide a more equitable solution than negotiation. 3 lots were prepared, each representing one of the major cosmic domains: the heavens and the upper atmosphere, the seas and all bodies of water, and the underworld with its associated realms of the dead. The brothers would draw these lots in order of age, with the results determining their eternal responsibilities and spheres of influence. Hades, as the eldest, drew first and received dominion over the underworld, the realm of the dead and all the subterranean regions that lay beneath the surface of the earth. The lot included not only Tartarus, where the defeated Titans were imprisoned, but also the Elysian fields, the Asphodel meadows, and the various other regions where mortal souls would spend their afterlives. His domain extended through vast networks of caves, underground rivers, and hidden valleys that existed in dimensions parallel to the surface world. Poseidon drew second and claimed authority over all bodies of water, from the smallest streams to the vast oceans that surrounded the known world. His realm included not only the surface waters, but also the underwater kingdoms, sea caves, and the mysterious depths where ancient sea monsters made their homes. The power to control tides, storms, and earthquakes came with his dominion, making him responsible for many of the natural phenomena that most directly affected mortal civilizations. Zeus, drawing last, received the heavens and the upper atmosphere, along with the responsibility for weather patterns, celestial phenomena, and the maintenance of cosmic order. His domain included Mount Olympus as the seat of divine government, making him the de facto ruler of the new pantheon, while his brothers maintained sovereignty within their respective spheres. The arrangement created a balance of power that prevented any single deity from accumulating too much authority, while ensuring that all major aspects of existence remained under divine supervision. The division satisfied each brother's natural inclinations and abilities while creating a system of government that could adapt to future challenges. Hades' preference for solitude and his experience with darkness made him ideally suited for ruling the underworld, where his duties would involve judging the dead and maintaining the cosmic balance between life and death. His helmet's power over invisibility and shadow would prove invaluable in his new role, allowing him to move unseen through both his own realm and the world above when his duties required such travel. The cosmic lottery had sealed Hades' destiny as Lord of the Underworld, but the realm he inherited bore little resemblance to the organized kingdom of the dead that would later become legendary throughout the ancient world. The subterranean domain consisted primarily of Tartarus, the primordial prison that had housed the Cyclopes and now contained the defeated Titans, surrounded by vast networks of natural caves, underground rivers, and dimensional spaces that existed without purpose or structure. The transition from these chaotic depths to a functioning afterlife required unprecedented acts of divine engineering and administrative organization. Hades began his work by conducting extensive surveys of his new territory, using his helmet's power to explore regions that had remained hidden since the formation of the cosmos. The underground realm extended far beyond what surface dwellers might imagine, with cavern systems that stretched across continents and vertical shafts that descended through multiple layers of reality. Some chambers were so vast that they contained their own weather systems, complete with underground storms and precipitation cycles that had operated independently for millennia. The most significant geographical features Hades discovered were 5 primordial rivers that flowed through different regions of the underworld, each carrying waters imbued with supernatural properties that reflected fundamental aspects of human experience and divine justice. These waterways had existed since the earliest days of creation, but their potential as organizational tools for managing the afterlife had never been recognized or exploited by previous rulers of the underworld. The river Styx commanded particular attention due to its unique properties and strategic importance. This waterway flowed in a great circle around the entire underworld, its dark waters carrying the power to bind even the gods themselves to any oath sworn upon them. The river's source emerged from a towering waterfall that descended from unknown heights, while its mouth disappeared into dimensional spaces that defied conventional geography. The waters themselves appeared black as obsidian, yet they reflected images with perfect clarity, creating an unsettling mirror effect that revealed truths the viewer might prefer to keep hidden. Hades recognized the Styx's potential as both a natural boundary and a tool for maintaining cosmic order. The river's oath-binding properties could serve as the foundation for contracts between the living and the dead, while its circular course provided a natural defensive barrier that would make unauthorized entry into the underworld extremely difficult. He established the first ferry crossing at a narrow point where the river's current slowed enough to allow safe passage, though the location would require careful management to prevent overcrowding and maintain proper security protocols. The River Acheron presented different challenges and opportunities for the underworld's development. Known as the River of Woe, its waters carried the concentrated sorrow of every mortal who had ever lived, creating a flow that could induce overwhelming grief in any living being who approached too closely. The river's course meandered through the central regions of the underworld, its banks lined with weeping willows whose branches drooped into the water and absorbed some of the emotional intensity that made the waterway so dangerous to traverse. Hades discovered that the Acheron's sorrowful properties could be channeled and controlled through careful engineering projects. By constructing a series of dams and channels, he could regulate the river's emotional intensity, creating areas where the waters remained navigable while maintaining regions of concentrated grief that could serve specific purposes in processing newly arrived souls. The controlled flooding of certain areas with Acheron water would prove invaluable for helping the dead come to terms with their transition from life to afterlife. The third major waterway, the River Cocytus, carried the lamentations and regrets of the dead in its icy waters. This river of wailing flowed through the coldest regions of the underworld, its temperature remaining perpetually below freezing despite the absence of any obvious cooling mechanism. The sound of flowing water was accompanied by a constant chorus of voices expressing remorse, creating an audio landscape that could drive listeners to despair if they remained exposed to it for extended periods. Hades recognized the Cocytus as an ideal location for housing souls who required extended periods of reflection and repentance before proceeding to their final destinations. The river's natural properties would encourage introspection while preventing the kind of violent outbursts that might disrupt the underworld's operations. He ordered the construction of contemplation chambers along the riverbanks, structures designed to amplify the water's psychological effects while providing shelter from the harsh cold that made the area otherwise uninhabitable. The River Phlegethon presented the opposite extreme, its waters composed entirely of liquid fire that burned without consuming fuel or producing smoke. This river of flame flowed through the underworld's most arid regions, its banks consisting of volcanic glass and pumice stone that had been shaped by millennia of exposure to supernatural heat. The flames that constituted the river's substance burned in colours that did not exist in the mortal world, creating a visual spectacle that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The Phlegethon's fiery nature made it the obvious choice for punishing souls whose crimes required more aggressive correction than simple contemplation could provide. Hades designed a series of graduated exposure protocols that would allow precise calibration of punishment intensity based on the severity of each soul's transgressions. The river's flames could cause excruciating pain without inflicting permanent damage on immortal souls, making it an ideal tool for rehabilitation programs that required extended periods of corrective treatment. The final river, Lethe, flowed with waters that could erase memory completely, offering both blessing and curse depending on how they were employed. The river of forgetfulness wound through peaceful meadows where the temperature remained comfortable, and the landscape showed no signs of the supernatural forces that dominated other regions of the underworld. Souls who drank from Lethe would lose all recollection of their mortal lives, allowing them to begin their afterlife experiences without the burden of earthly attachments or regrets. Hades established strict protocols governing access to the Lethe's waters, recognizing that memory erasure represented an irreversible process that required careful consideration before implementation. Some souls would benefit from forgetting traumatic experiences that prevented them from adapting to their new existence, while others needed to retain their memories as part of their ongoing development or punishment. The river's banks were lined with consultation chambers where newly arrived souls could receive counselling about whether drinking from Lethe would serve their best interests. The systematic organisation of these 5 rivers created the foundation for a comprehensive afterlife management system that could process souls according to their individual needs and circumstances. Each waterway served specific functions within the broader structure of divine justice, while their interconnected courses created natural pathways for moving souls between different regions of the underworld as their situations changed over time. Beyond the geographical infrastructure, Hades recognized the need for fundamental laws that would govern the operation of death, judgment, and afterlife administration. These regulations needed to be comprehensive enough to cover every possible situation, while remaining flexible enough to accommodate the unique circumstances that individual cases might present. The legal framework he developed would establish precedents that would influence divine justice throughout the ancient world. The primary law established the principle of universal jurisdiction over all mortal souls, regardless of their origin, social status, or the circumstances of their death. Every human being who died would come under Hades' authority, with no exceptions based on wealth, power, or divine favour. This principle represented a radical departure from earlier systems, where influential individuals could sometimes negotiate special treatment or avoid judgment entirely through political connections or religious interventions. The second fundamental law established the irreversible nature of death under normal circumstances, preventing the kind of arbitrary resurrections that could undermine the cosmic balance between life and death. Once a soul had crossed into the underworld and been officially processed through the judgment system, return to mortal life would require extraordinary justification and approval from multiple divine authorities. This regulation protected both the integrity of the afterlife system and the natural order that depended on predictable transitions between life and death. The third law created a comprehensive classification system for different types of souls based on their moral conduct during life. This framework established categories ranging from the exceptionally virtuous to the irredeemably wicked, with numerous intermediate classifications that could accommodate the moral complexity that characterized most human lives. Each category carried specific requirements for judgment procedures, punishment or reward protocols, and long-term placement within the underworld's various regions. The implementation of these laws required an extensive administrative apparatus, staffed by beings capable of handling the complex responsibilities that effective afterlife management demanded. Hades began recruiting personnel from among the various supernatural entities that had remained neutral during the Titanomachy. offering them positions that would utilize their unique abilities while providing them with stable employment in the new cosmic order. Charon emerged as the most significant of these early appointments, accepting the position of chief ferryman responsible for transporting souls across the river Styx. The ancient boatman had operated independently for countless centuries, ferrying occasional travellers across various underworld waterways without any formal authority or organisational structure. His extensive experience with the underground river systems and his natural resistance to the supernatural effects of underworld waters made him an ideal candidate for managing the increased traffic that organised afterlife processing would generate. Charon's boat required significant modifications to handle the volume of souls that would need transportation once the judgment system became fully operational. The original vessel had been designed for occasional passengers, but the new requirements demanded capacity for hundreds of souls per journey while maintaining the safety and security standards that underworld travel required. Hades commissioned the Cyclops to construct a new ferry that could expand or contract its size based on passenger load while retaining the mystical properties that allowed navigation through supernatural waters. The ferryman's compensation system established important precedents for underworld economics and the relationship between the living and the dead. Each soul seeking passage across the Styx would be required to pay Charon with coins that had been placed on their eyes or under their tongues during funeral preparations. This requirement created incentives for proper burial practices while generating revenue that could support the underworld's expanding operations. Souls who arrived without payment would be required to wait on the riverbank for a century before receiving free passage, a policy that encouraged advanced planning while avoiding permanent exclusion from the afterlife system. The establishment of a formal judgment system required the appointment of qualified judges who could evaluate the moral worth of souls with fairness, consistency, and appropriate attention to the complexities that characterized human behavior. Hades selected 3 individuals whose reputations for wisdom and justice had been established during their mortal lives, offering them positions that would allow them to continue their judicial work on a cosmic scale. Minos of Crete accepted appointment as the chief judge, responsible for overseeing the entire judgment process and handling the most complex cases that required exceptional wisdom and experience. His legendary reputation for fair and impartial justice during his reign as mortal king made him the obvious choice for this crucial position. Minos established the basic procedures that would govern all judgment sessions, including evidence presentation protocols, standards for witness testimony, and appeal processes that would prevent miscarriages of justice. Rhadamanthus, Minos' brother, became the specialist judge for Asian souls, bringing his expertise in the legal traditions and moral systems of the eastern regions to bear on cases that required cultural sensitivity and specialized knowledge. His appointment recognized the diversity of moral frameworks that existed among different human populations and the need for judges who could evaluate souls according to the standards that had governed their lives rather than imposing uniform criteria that might not account for cultural differences. Aeacus of Aegina received appointment as the judge for European souls, his reputation for absolute honesty and moral integrity making him particularly suitable for cases involving complex ethical questions or situations where traditional legal categories proved inadequate. His role included developing new precedents for unusual cases and serving as the final arbiter in disputes between the other judges about proper classification or sentencing procedures. The 3 judges established their courtroom in a vast circular chamber carved from a single piece of black marble, its walls decorated with scenes depicting the consequences of various moral choices. The chamber's acoustics were designed to ensure that every word spoken during proceedings could be heard clearly by all participants, while magical lighting systems provided illumination that revealed truth and prevented deception. Each judge occupied a throne positioned to provide optimal viewing of the evidence presentation area while maintaining appropriate dignity and authority. The Erinyes, also known as the Furies, accepted positions as the primary enforcement arm of underworld justice, their natural inclinations toward punishment and vengeance making them ideal candidates for ensuring that judicial decisions were implemented effectively. Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone had operated independently since their birth from the blood of Uranus, pursuing vengeance against those who committed crimes against family members or violated sacred oaths. Their incorporation into the formal justice system provided them with official authority while channeling their destructive impulses toward constructive purposes. These three sisters established their headquarters in the region surrounding the river Phlegethon, where their work of punishing the wicked could proceed without disturbing the peaceful areas reserved for virtuous souls. Their enforcement methods ranged from psychological torment designed to encourage repentance to physical punishment calibrated according to the severity of each soul's crimes. The Erinyes developed specialized techniques for different types of offenses, ensuring that punishment would be both appropriate to the crime and effective in achieving the rehabilitation or deterrence goals that underworld justice sought to accomplish. The creation of distinct regions within the underworld required massive construction projects that would provide appropriate environments for souls of different moral classifications. These areas needed to accommodate the eternal residence of countless individuals while maintaining the atmospheric conditions and social structures that would best serve their inhabitants' long-term development or punishment needs. The Elysian Fields represented the most ambitious of these construction projects, designed as a paradise that would reward the exceptionally virtuous with eternal happiness and fulfillment. This region required the creation of perfect climate conditions, with gentle breezes, comfortable temperatures, and seasonal variations that provided interest without causing discomfort. The landscape combined the most beautiful features of mortal geography with supernatural enhancements that created vistas of unprecedented beauty and serenity. The fields included recreational facilities for every possible interest and talent, from athletic competitions that could accommodate superhuman abilities to artistic workshops where souls could pursue creative endeavours without the limitations that mortality had imposed on their ambitions. Libraries contained every work of literature, philosophy and science that had ever been created, while theatres presented performances by the greatest artists from throughout history. The social structure encouraged friendship and intellectual discourse while preventing the conflicts and jealousies that could disrupt the peaceful atmosphere. Tartarus required extensive modifications to transform it from a simple prison into a comprehensive punishment facility that could accommodate different levels of criminal behaviour while maintaining security standards that would prevent escapes or disruptions. The region was divided into multiple security zones, with the most dangerous criminals confined in the deepest levels under constant supervision by the 100-handed ones, while lesser offenders occupied areas that allowed more freedom of movement within controlled environments. The punishment systems installed throughout Tartarus utilized the natural properties of the underworld's supernatural environment, while adding technological innovations that increased their effectiveness and precision. The river Phlegethon's flames were channeled through elaborate pipe systems that could deliver precisely calibrated heat to individual cells, while Cocytus water was used to create chambers where criminals could experience the full emotional impact of their victims' suffering. These facilities operated according to strict protocols that prevented excessive cruelty while ensuring that punishment remained severe enough to serve deterrent and rehabilitative purposes. The Asphodel Meadows presented different design challenges, as this region needed to accommodate the vast majority of human souls whose moral records fell into the neutral category between exceptional virtue and serious criminality. These individuals required environments that provided basic comfort and security, while offering opportunities for continued moral development and eventual progression to more desirable areas of the underworld. The meadows were designed as vast grasslands dotted with simple but comfortable dwellings that could house souls individually or in small groups, according to their preferences and compatibility. community centres provided opportunities for social interaction, education, and recreational activities that encouraged personal growth and moral reflection. The region's administration focused on identifying souls who showed potential for advancement to the Elysian fields, while providing support and guidance for those who needed additional time to resolve moral issues from their earthly lives. The establishment of the Underworld's administrative systems and physical infrastructure had consumed decades of Hades' attention, transforming him from a warrior god into a meticulous ruler whose days were filled with judicial reviews, territorial surveys, and the endless complexities of managing eternal souls. His realm functioned with clockwork precision, the rivers flowing according to their designated purposes, the judges maintaining their careful deliberations, and the various regions housing their assigned populations in appropriate comfort or punishment. Yet this professional success came at a personal cost that Hades had not anticipated when he first drew the lot that determined his cosmic responsibilities. The isolation inherent in ruling the underworld proved far more profound than the physical solitude he had experienced during his imprisonment within Cronus. While his father's stomach had confined his body, his current position confined his entire existence to a realm where meaningful relationships seemed impossible to develop or maintain. The souls under his jurisdiction, regardless of their moral classification, remained fundamentally different from living beings in ways that prevented genuine companionship. Even the most virtuous residents of the Elysian fields carried the essential nature of the dead, their conversations and interactions shaped by the finality of their earthly experiences in ways that created an unbridgeable gap between them and their immortal ruler. His administrative staff, while competent and loyal, consisted primarily of beings whose natures aligned them with death, judgment and punishment rather than the warmer aspects of existence that Hades found himself increasingly craving. Charon's conversations focused exclusively on transportation logistics and passenger management. The three judges discussed legal precedents and moral philosophy with scholarly detachment that rarely touched on personal matters. The Erinyes, despite their effectiveness in enforcement roles, remained creatures of vengeance whose emotional range centered on righteous anger and the satisfaction of justice, served rather than the companionship that could ease the loneliness of eternal rule. The rare occasions when Hades visited the surface world for official business only intensified his awareness of what his position cost him in terms of personal fulfillment. Mount Olympus bustled with social activity, romantic relationships, and the kind of casual interactions that made immortal existence bearable across infinite time. Zeus maintained relationships with numerous goddesses and mortal women, his romantic adventures providing both entertainment and emotional satisfaction that balanced the responsibilities of cosmic leadership. Poseidon had established similar connections within his aquatic domain, forming alliances and romantic partnerships with sea nymphs, ocean goddesses, and other beings whose natures complemented his own. The contrast between his brother's social lives and his own isolation became particularly stark during family gatherings on Olympus, where Hades observed the complex web of relationships that had developed among the younger generation of gods. Aphrodite's arrival had introduced romantic love as a major force in divine society, her influence creating partnerships and rivalries that provided constant sources of drama and engagement. Athena pursued intellectual relationships that satisfied her need for mental stimulation, while Artemis had established a community of followers who shared her interests and values. Even Ares, despite his reputation for violence and conflict, maintained numerous romantic connections that provided him with emotional outlets beyond warfare. Hades recognized that his position as ruler of the dead created unique obstacles to forming meaningful relationships with other divine beings. Most gods and goddesses associated him with endings, loss, and the darker aspects of existence that they preferred to avoid contemplating. His presence at social gatherings often created uncomfortable silences, as other immortals struggled to find conversation topics that did not remind them of mortality and its consequences. The helmet of invisibility that had served him so well during the Titanomachy became a metaphor for his social existence, as he often felt invisible even when physically present among his peers. The psychological pressure of this isolation began manifesting in ways that affected his administrative efficiency and decision-making abilities. Judgment sessions that had once proceeded with smooth precision now sometimes stalled, as Hades found his attention wandering to observations about the relationships the deceased souls had enjoyed during their mortal lives, the love letters and personal mementos that arrived with certain souls placed in their burial preparations by grieving spouses or lovers, created painful reminders of the emotional connections that his position seemed to preclude. His surveys of the Underworld's vast territories, once conducted with scientific detachment and administrative focus, increasingly became opportunities for solitary contemplation of his circumstances. The beautiful but empty landscapes of the Elysian fields mocked him with their perfection, designed to provide happiness for others while offering him only the satisfaction of successful urban planning. The peaceful meadows where virtuous souls spent their eternities in contentment highlighted the absence of anyone with whom he could share similar peace and satisfaction. The turning point came during one of these solitary expeditions through the upper regions of his domain, areas that bordered on the surface world and occasionally allowed glimpses of mortal activities through dimensional gaps and natural cave openings. Hades had been investigating reports of unauthorized communication between living mortals and deceased souls, a violation of underworld regulations that required his personal attention to resolve effectively. The investigation led him through a series of caverns that eventually opened onto a hidden grotto, where sunlight filtered down through an opening that connected to a meadow in the world above. The sight that greeted him through this natural window stopped him completely in his tracks, creating an emotional impact that would reshape the entire trajectory of his existence. A young woman moved through the meadow above with a grace and beauty that seemed to embody everything missing from his underground realm. Her hair caught the sunlight like spun gold, creating a luminous halo effect that made her appear almost divine even from his distant vantage point. Her movements possessed a natural elegance that suggested both innocence and an unconscious awareness of her own attractiveness. She was gathering flowers with the focused attention of someone who found genuine joy in the simple beauty of natural things, her selections creating a bouquet that combined colours and textures with an artistic sensibility that spoke to a refined aesthetic appreciation. Each blossom was examined carefully before being added to her collection, her face expressing delight at particularly beautiful specimens and gentle consideration for flowers that did not meet her standards. The entire scene radiated a warmth and vitality that created a stark contrast to the eternal stillness that characterized even the most pleasant regions of the underworld. Hades found himself transfixed by this vision of life and beauty, his administrative concerns forgotten as he watched her movements with an attention that bordered on obsession. The woman's obvious pleasure in her simple task, her unconscious grace, and the way sunlight seemed to follow her movements created an image that burned itself into his memory with the intensity of Zeus's lightning bolts. For the first time since assuming his role as ruler of the dead, he encountered something that made him question whether his current existence provided adequate compensation for the sacrifices his position required. The rational part of his mind recognized the dangerous territory his thoughts were entering, but the emotional deprivation of centuries of isolation proved stronger than administrative caution. He began visiting the grotto regularly, timing his appearances to coincide with the young woman's flower-gathering expeditions. Each observation session provided new details about her personality and interests, building a mental portrait that grew more compelling with each encounter. Her name, he learned through careful eavesdropping on her conversations with companions, was Persephone, and she was the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture and harvest. This parentage explained both her natural affinity for growing things and the divine radiance that had initially attracted his attention. As a goddess in her own right, though still in the maiden stage of her development, she possessed the immortal nature that would make a relationship theoretically possible, while maintaining the innocence and vitality that made her so appealing to his death-weary sensibilities. The knowledge of her divine status intensified both his attraction and his awareness of the complications that pursuing such an interest would create. Demeter's protective nature regarding her daughter was legendary throughout the divine community, her fierce maternal instincts having prevented numerous gods from developing relationships with Persephone, despite her obvious attractiveness. Any approach would need to navigate not only Persephone's own preferences, but also her mother's formidable opposition to suitors who might take her daughter away from the agricultural work they shared. More significantly, Hades recognized that his own nature and responsibilities created fundamental incompatibilities with what Persephone represented. She embodied growth, renewal, and the life-giving forces that brought joy to mortal existence, while his realm represented endings, finality, and separation from everything she seemed to value most. The contrast between her flower-filled meadows and his rivers of woe seemed to preclude any possibility of genuine compatibility, yet the attraction he felt continued to intensify with each observation. The internal conflict between desire and rational analysis might have continued indefinitely, if not for the intervention of external forces that transformed his private obsession into a cosmic crisis. Eros, the god of love whose arrows could inspire passion in even the most resistant hearts, had been observing Hades' situation with the professional interest of a craftsman evaluating a particularly challenging project. The ruler of the Underworld's emotional isolation presented exactly the kind of difficult case that Eros found most satisfying to resolve, while the potential complications promised the sort of dramatic consequences that made divine interventions memorable. The decision to act came during a conversation between Eros and his mother Aphrodite, who had grown concerned about the psychological state of her brother-in-law and its potential impact on the stability of the cosmic order. Hades' increasing distraction from his administrative duties had begun affecting the efficiency of soul processing and judgment procedures, creating backlogs that could eventually disrupt the natural cycle of death and rebirth that maintained balance between the mortal and divine worlds. Aphrodite recognized that conventional approaches to matchmaking would prove ineffective in Hades' case, given both his social isolation and the unique challenges that his position created for potential romantic partners. A direct introduction would likely result in rejection based on fear or incompatibility, while gradual courtship seemed impossible given the fundamental differences between the underworld and surface environments. The situation required a more dramatic intervention that would create circumstances forcing both parties to confront their feelings without the usual social barriers and expectations. Zeus's involvement in the developing plan reflected both his concern for his brother's welfare and his recognition that Hades' emotional state had begun affecting his administrative performance in ways that could threaten cosmic stability. The king of the gods had received reports about delayed soul processing and inconsistent judgment decisions that suggested Hades' distraction was creating systemic problems within the underworld's operations. While Zeus respected his brother's autonomy in personal matters, the potential for administrative breakdown required intervention before the situation deteriorated further. The plan that emerged from these consultations combined Eros's expertise in romantic manipulation with Zeus's authority over cosmic affairs and Aphrodite's understanding of the psychological dynamics that governed successful relationships. Rather than attempting to arrange a conventional courtship that would likely fail due to the fundamental incompatibilities between the potential partners' natures and responsibilities, they decided to create circumstances that would force an immediate and dramatic confrontation between Hades and Persephone, bypassing the gradual development process that normal relationships required. The timing of their intervention was carefully calculated to coincide with one of Persephone's regular flower-gathering expeditions, when she would be alone and focused on her task rather than surrounded by companions who might interfere with the planned encounter. The location chosen was the same meadow where Hades had first observed her, its isolation from major population centres, ensuring that the dramatic events about to unfold would not be immediately interrupted by well-meaning rescuers or curious observers. Eros positioned himself where his arrow would have a clear trajectory to Hades' heart, at the moment when the god of the underworld emerged from his hidden observation post. The arrow he selected for this particular mission had been crafted specifically for resistant targets, its point forged from adamantine and fletched with feathers from the wings of the fates themselves. The magical properties imbued in this weapon could overcome even divine resistance to romantic attraction, ensuring that Hades would experience the full intensity of passionate love regardless of his rational objections or psychological defences. The moment of impact came as Hades watched Persephone select a particularly beautiful narcissus flower, her expression of delight at its perfect form creating exactly the kind of vulnerable, joyful moment that Eros had been waiting for. The arrow struck with the precision that had made the love god legendary throughout the ancient world, its magical payload flooding Hades' system with romantic passion that transformed his careful observation into overwhelming desire for immediate action. The psychological transformation was instantaneous and complete, rational consideration of consequences replaced by urgent need to claim the object of his newly intensified affection. The careful plans he had been developing for a gradual approach dissolved under the pressure of magically enhanced passion, replaced by an impulsive determination to resolve his emotional situation through direct action. The administrative responsibilities that had previously constrained his behaviour suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the overwhelming importance of securing Persephone's presence in his life. The earth beneath the meadow responded to Hades' emotional intensity and divine will, fractures appearing in the ground as his power over subterranean forces manifested without conscious control. The cracks widened rapidly, creating a chasm that extended directly down into the upper regions of the underworld, while providing a pathway that would allow him to reach the surface without the lengthy journey through conventional cave systems. The opening grew large enough to accommodate his chariot and horses, while remaining positioned to intercept Persephone's movements through the meadow. The chariot that emerged from this supernatural opening was unlike any vehicle that had previously appeared on the Earth's surface, its construction reflecting both Hades' divine status and his dominion over the forces of death and darkness. The framework was forged from black adamantine that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating a vehicle that seemed to exist as a void in the visible spectrum rather than a solid object. The wheels were rimmed with obsidian that had been shaped by the fires of the river Phlegethon, their surfaces carved with images depicting the various stages of death and judgment that awaited all mortal beings. 4 immortal horses drew this supernatural conveyance, their coats black as the deepest night and their eyes glowing with the cold fire that illuminated the darkest regions of Tartarus. These were not ordinary divine steeds, but creatures born from the shadows themselves, capable of travelling between dimensions and moving through solid matter as easily as through empty air. The hoofbeats produced no sound on earthly ground, but created resonances in the supernatural spectrum that could be heard throughout the underworld, announcing their master's presence to every soul under his dominion. Hades himself appeared in his full divine regalia, the casual administrative clothing he wore during routine underworld business, replaced by the formal attire appropriate for a cosmic ruler asserting his authority in the mortal realm. His robes were woven from darkness itself, their fabric shifting and flowing in patterns that suggested hidden depths and infinite space. The helm of darkness rested on his brow, not activated for invisibility, but worn as a crown that proclaimed his sovereignty over the realm of the dead and all its associated powers. Persephone's reaction to this sudden apparition reflected the natural terror that mortals and minor deities experienced when confronted by the unexpected presence of death personified. The flower she had been examining fell from nerveless fingers as she stared at the impossible sight of the earth, opening to reveal a ruler whose very existence reminded all living beings of their ultimate fate. Her divine nature prevented the complete paralysis that would have afflicted a mortal in similar circumstances, but the shock of the encounter left her momentarily unable to respond with either flight or resistance. The abduction itself proceeded with the efficiency that characterized all of Hades' administrative actions, though driven by passion rather than bureaucratic procedure. His arm swept around Persephone's waist with the irresistible force of a natural disaster, lifting her into the chariot before her divine reflexes could activate in self-defense. The supernatural horses responded to their master's urgency without requiring verbal commands, wheeling the vehicle toward the chasm that provided access to the underworld, while their hooves began the transition from earthly ground to the dimensional pathways that connected different realms of existence. Persephone's cries for help echoed across the meadow and beyond, her divine voice carrying supernatural power that could be heard by any deity within hundreds of miles of the abduction site. The sound expressed not only fear and outrage, but also a desperate appeal for rescue that should have brought immediate response from her mother or other protective deities. However, the careful timing of the abduction had ensured that Demeter was occupied with agricultural duties in a distant region, while other potential rescuers were engaged in their own responsibilities or deliberately avoiding involvement in what they recognized as a family matter among the ruling gods. The descent into the underworld proceeded along routes that Hades had prepared specifically for this moment, pathways that bypassed the usual entry points where Charon or other administrative personnel might question his actions or delay the journey. The chariot moved through dimensional spaces that existed parallel to the normal cave systems, travelling distances that would have required hours through conventional passages in mere minutes of supernatural transit. The horse's ability to phase through solid matter allowed them to take direct routes that ignored the geographical obstacles that would have impeded normal vehicles. As they descended through the layers of reality that separated the surface world from the realm of the dead, Persephone experienced the gradual transition from the warm, life-giving environment of her mother's domain to the eternal twilight that characterized Hades' kingdom. The temperature dropped steadily, while the air took on the distinctive quality that marked the boundary between life and death. The sounds of the living world, bird songs, wind through leaves, the distant voices of mortals going about their daily activities, faded and disappeared, replaced by the subtle whispers and echoes that filled the spaces between the underworld's more dramatically defined regions. The psychological impact of this transition affected Persephone more profoundly than the physical changes in her environment. The gradual separation from everything familiar and life-affirming created a sense of loss that went beyond simple homesickness, touching the fundamental aspects of her nature as a goddess associated with growth and renewal. Each mile of descent took her further from the sources of power and identity that had defined her existence, while bringing her closer to forces and concepts that represented everything opposite to her essential nature. Hades, despite the magical passion that drove his actions, retained enough awareness to recognize the trauma his abduction was inflicting on his intended bride. The sight of her distress created internal conflict between his overwhelming desire to secure her presence and his natural inclination toward justice and proper treatment of those under his authority. The rational part of his mind understood that beginning a relationship through kidnapping violated every principle of consent and mutual respect that should govern romantic partnerships. Yet the magical compulsion created by Eros's arrow made compromise or reconsideration impossible. The arrival at his palace marked the completion of the abduction, but the beginning of a far more complex phase in their relationship. The Underworld's royal residence had been designed to accommodate a single occupant whose preferences ran toward functionality and efficiency rather than comfort or aesthetic appeal. The addition of a second resident, particularly one whose nature and interests differed so dramatically from the rulers, would require extensive modifications to both the physical structure and the social routines that had governed palace life for centuries. The palace itself occupied a vast cavern that had been carved from a single piece of black marble, its walls polished to mirror smoothness and decorated with scenes depicting the various aspects of death, judgment, and afterlife administration. The furniture was constructed from materials that reflected the underworld's supernatural nature. Chairs carved from petrified wood that had grown in Tartarus, tables made from volcanic glass shaped by the fires of Phlegethon, and tapestries woven from the silk of spiders that fed on the dreams of sleeping souls. Persephone's first glimpse of her new surroundings confirmed her worst fears about what her future might hold in this realm of eternal darkness and administrative efficiency. Every surface reminded her of death and endings, while the absence of any growing things created an environment that felt actively hostile to her nature as a goddess of vegetation and renewal. The carefully organised spaces spoke of a mind that valued order and control above beauty or comfort, suggesting that her captor's personality might prove as incompatible with her own as his chosen domain. The transformation of Hades from a reluctant ruler into the undisputed master of death's domain required the development of divine attributes that extended far beyond his initial role as administrator of the afterlife. His dominion over the dead encompassed not merely the judgment and placement of souls, but the fundamental control over the transition between life and death itself. This authority manifested through his ability to sense the moment of any mortal's death anywhere in the world, his consciousness automatically registering each soul's departure from the living realm and its arrival within his jurisdiction. The sensation came as a subtle vibration in his awareness, similar to how a spider feels the trembling of its web when prey becomes entangled, allowing him to monitor the constant flow of mortality without conscious effort. His power over death extended beyond passive awareness to active intervention in the dying process when circumstances required divine attention. Terminal illnesses that lingered beyond their natural course, deaths that occurred through supernatural interference, or situations where the boundary between life and death became blurred through magical intervention, all fell under his direct authority to resolve. He could accelerate the dying process for those whose suffering had become unbearable, or delay death temporarily when cosmic balance required additional time for proper preparation of the soul's transition. The most significant aspect of his dominion involved the irreversible nature of death under his authority. Once a soul had been officially processed through the Underworld's judgment system and assigned to its appropriate afterlife location, return to mortal existence became virtually impossible without his explicit permission. This power protected the cosmic order from the chaos that would result if death became a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent transition, while also establishing his authority as absolute within his designated sphere of influence. The control over precious metals and gems that emerged from beneath the earth represented another crucial aspect of Hades' divine portfolio, one that connected his underground realm to the economic system of the surface world. Every vein of gold, silver, copper and iron that miners discovered had passed through regions under his ultimate jurisdiction, making him the source of the mineral wealth that formed the foundation of mortal civilizations. His awareness extended to every deposit of precious stones, from common garnets to rare diamonds, allowing him to influence the discovery and extraction of materials that could dramatically alter the balance of power among mortal kingdoms. This authority over subterranean wealth operated through his connection to the Earth's deepest layers, where geological processes created the conditions necessary for metal formation and gem crystallization. He could sense the location of undiscovered deposits with perfect accuracy, guide mining operations toward or away from valuable finds, and even influence the quality and purity of extracted materials. The legendary wealth of certain kingdoms often resulted from his favour, while the sudden depletion of previously productive minds might indicate his displeasure with how rulers treated their subjects or honoured their obligations to the gods. The practical applications of this power extended to the Underworld's own infrastructure and operations. The construction materials for his palace and administrative buildings came from the finest examples of every type of stone and metal found within the earth, their quality surpassing anything available to surface dwellers. The tools and weapons used by his staff were forged from materials that combined supernatural durability with perfect craftsmanship, while the currency used for underworld transactions consisted of coins minted from metals that existed nowhere else in creation. His role as ruler and judge of the dead required the development of judicial powers that could evaluate the moral worth of souls with perfect accuracy and absolute fairness. This ability manifested through his capacity to perceive the complete history of any soul's moral choices during its mortal existence, seeing not only the actions themselves, but also the motivations, circumstances, and consequences that surrounded each decision. The process resembled reading a book written in the soul's essence, where every page contained detailed records of moral choices and their impacts on others. The judgment process itself involved weighing these moral records against the standards of divine justice that had been established since the creation of the cosmic order. Hades could assess not only the obvious crimes and virtues that characterized a soul's earthly life, but also the subtle patterns of behavior that revealed character traits like compassion, courage, honesty, and wisdom. His decisions took into account the full complexity of human nature, recognizing that most souls contained mixtures of good and evil that required careful evaluation to determine appropriate afterlife placement. The maintenance of cosmic balance between life and death represented perhaps his most crucial responsibility, requiring constant monitoring of the flow between the mortal and immortal realms to ensure that neither became overwhelmed by excessive population. His decisions about when to allow resurrections, how to handle premature deaths, and whether to intervene in situations where the natural order faced disruption all served to maintain the stability that allowed both realms to function properly. This balancing act required sophisticated understanding of how changes in one realm affected conditions in the other, along with the wisdom to make decisions that served long-term cosmic stability rather than short-term convenience. The development of his various epithets reflected the different aspects of his divine nature as they became recognized and honored by both mortal and immortal observers. The name Pluto, meaning the wealthy one, emerged from widespread recognition of his control over the Earth's mineral treasures and the prosperity that could result from his favor. Mortal rulers who sought his blessing often commissioned temples decorated with the finest examples of metalwork and gem cutting, hoping to demonstrate their appreciation for his gifts, while encouraging continued generosity and revealing new sources of wealth within their territories. The Roman equivalent Dispater, meaning rich father, emphasized both his paternal authority over the dead and his role as the source of the underground riches that supported civilization's development. This title reflected the Roman understanding of divine authority as fundamentally connected to practical benefits for human society, recognizing that his control over mineral wealth made him as important to earthly prosperity as his brother Zeus was to weather and agriculture. Roman merchants and miners developed elaborate rituals for seeking his favor, including the sacrifice of black animals, whose blood was poured into the earth as offerings to the god who controlled their livelihood source. The epithet Idoneus, derived from his role as the unseen ruler whose presence could be felt but not directly observed, captured the mysterious nature of his authority over death and the afterlife. This name emphasized his ability to remain invisible while exercising power throughout both the underworld and the surface world, reflecting the way death's influence touched every aspect of mortal existence, without being directly visible until the moment of transition. The title also acknowledged his use of the Helm of Darkness, which allowed him to move unseen through any realm while maintaining his authority over the forces under his command. Other epithets developed by different cultures reflected local understanding of his various roles and attributes. The Greeks sometimes called him Clymenus, meaning renowned or notorious, acknowledging his fame throughout the ancient world as the one deity whose authority no mortal could escape or challenge. The title Eucles, meaning good counsellor, recognized his role in providing guidance to souls during their transition from life to death, while Stygius connected him directly to the river Styx and its power to bind even the gods themselves to their sworn oaths. The sacred symbols associated with his worship developed organically from his various divine attributes and the practical requirements of honouring a deity whose realm remained largely hidden from direct observation. The cypress tree became closely associated with his cult due to its natural characteristics and symbolic significance in ancient funeral practices. These evergreen trees, with their dark foliage and towering height, created appropriate atmospheres for contemplating mortality, while their wood provided excellent material for constructing coffins and funeral pyres. The cypress's ability to thrive in rocky, difficult soil made it a natural choice for planting in cemeteries and around temples dedicated to the Lord of the Dead. The symbolic significance of the cypress extended beyond its practical applications to represent the eternal nature of the soul's existence after death. The tree's evergreen nature symbolized the continuity of consciousness beyond the physical death of the body, while its upward growth pattern suggested the soul's journey toward divine judgment and ultimate placement in appropriate afterlife regions. Many temples dedicated to Hades featured groves of cypress trees that created natural sanctuaries where worshippers could meditate on mortality and prepare spiritually for their own eventual transitions to the underworld. The narcissus flower carried particular significance due to its role in the abduction of Persephone, but its symbolic meaning extended beyond this specific mythological event to represent the dangerous beauty that could lead to spiritual transformation or destruction. The flower's tendency to grow near water sources made it appropriate for a deity whose realm was defined by supernatural rivers, while its intoxicating fragrance symbolized the seductive power of death that could attract souls away from earthly concerns toward eternal rest or punishment. The key emerged as perhaps the most powerful symbol of Hades' authority, representing his absolute control over access to and departure from the realm of the dead. This symbol emphasized the irreversible nature of death under normal circumstances, as a key that could lock but never unlock the doors between life and death. The keys associated with his worship were often crafted from black iron or obsidian, their surfaces decorated with images of skulls, pomegranates, or other symbols connected to death and the afterlife. These ritual objects served as focal points for prayers and offerings, directed toward the god who held ultimate authority over every soul's final destination. The cornucopia, or horn of plenty, represented the hidden wealth that lay beneath the earth's surface under Hades' control. This symbol acknowledged his role as the source of the precious metals and gems that formed the foundation of mortal prosperity, while also representing the abundance that awaited virtuous souls in the Elysian fields. The cornucopia's association with Hades differed from its connection to agricultural deities like Demeter, emphasizing wealth that came from beneath the earth rather than growing upon its surface. The development of formal worship practices required the establishment of temples and ritual procedures that could honor a deity whose realm remained largely inaccessible to living worshippers. These sacred spaces needed to create appropriate atmospheres for contemplating mortality, while providing practical facilities for the sacrifices and offerings that divine honor required. The architectural style that emerged for Hades' temples emphasized the underground nature of his domain through the use of dark stones, subterranean chambers, and lighting systems that created the dim, twilight conditions that characterized his realm. The most significant temples featured elaborate underground complexes that allowed worshippers to experience symbolic journeys into the underworld while remaining safely within the mortal realm. These facilities included chambers decorated with scenes depicting the various stages of death and judgment, pools filled with water from springs that emerged from deep underground sources, and altars positioned to receive offerings that would be consumed by fires that burned without producing visible flames. The overall effect created environments where the boundary between life and death seemed thin enough to allow meaningful communication with the Lord of the Underworld. The sacrificial practices associated with Hades' worship reflected both his authority over death and his control over underground wealth. Black animals, particularly bulls, sheep and pigs, were considered most appropriate for sacrifice, their dark coloration symbolizing the connection to his shadowy realm. The blood from these sacrifices was typically poured into the earth through specially constructed channels that carried it down into the underground regions where the god's influence was strongest. The meat was often burned completely rather than shared among worshippers, emphasizing that offerings to Hades were meant for his exclusive consumption rather than community feasting. Precious metals and gems formed another category of appropriate offerings, acknowledging his role as the source of such wealth, while demonstrating the worshippers' willingness to return valuable materials to their divine origin. Gold coins, silver jewellery and cut gems were often buried in temple grounds or thrown into sacred springs that connected to underground water systems. These offerings served both religious and practical purposes, as the accumulated wealth could support temple operations while demonstrating the community's prosperity and gratitude for the god's continued favour. The establishment of Hades as the undisputed ruler of the underworld created complex dynamics within the divine hierarchy that would influence cosmic politics for millennia to come. His relationship with Zeus, while founded on the brotherly bonds forged during their shared imprisonment within Cronus, developed tensions that reflected the fundamental differences between their respective domains and governing philosophies. Zeus ruled from the heights of Olympus with dramatic displays of power and frequent interventions in mortal affairs, his lightning bolts serving as visible reminders of divine authority that could be witnessed across vast distances. Hades, by contrast, exercised his influence through invisible mechanisms that operated beneath the surface of observable reality, his power manifesting through the inevitable processes of death and the hidden movements of subterranean wealth. These contrasting approaches to divine governance created friction whenever their jurisdictions overlapped, or when cosmic crises required coordinated responses from multiple realms. Zeus's tendency toward immediate decisive action often conflicted with Hades' preference for careful deliberation and systematic implementation of long-term solutions. The king of the gods would issue proclamations expecting instant compliance, while his elder brother required time to assess how such changes might affect the delicate balance of forces that maintained stability within the underworld's complex administrative systems. The most significant disputes arose over matters involving mortal souls whose deaths occurred under circumstances that blurred the boundaries between divine jurisdictions. When Zeus's lightning strikes killed individuals during his interventions in human conflicts, questions arose about whether these souls should receive standard processing through the Underworld's judgment system, or special consideration based on their death's divine causation. Hades insisted that all souls, regardless of how they died, must undergo the same evaluation procedures to maintain the integrity of cosmic justice. Zeus argued that deaths resulting from his direct actions should be treated as special cases that reflected his sovereign authority over mortal affairs. These jurisdictional conflicts extended to situations involving Zeus's numerous romantic relationships with mortal women, many of whom faced tragic consequences due to Hera's jealousy or the inherent dangers of divine involvement in human lives. When these women died, often under circumstances directly related to their relationships with the king of the gods, Hades found himself managing souls whose afterlife placement became politically complicated by their connections to his brother. The standard judgment procedures might classify certain actions as morally neutral or even virtuous, while Zeus's personal interest in these individuals created pressure for more favourable treatment that could undermine the impartial nature of underworld justice. The case of Semele, mother of Dionysus, exemplified these complications when her death by divine fire created unprecedented questions about appropriate afterlife placement. Her relationship with Zeus had been genuine rather than coercive, and her character showed no serious moral flaws that would justify punishment. Yet her death resulted directly from divine politics beyond her control. Hades' careful evaluation concluded that she deserved placement in the Elysian fields based on her virtue and the circumstances of her death. But Zeus's subsequent decision to elevate her to full godhood as Thyone created tensions about whether the underworld's authority extended to souls that other gods chose to resurrect or transform. Similar issues arose with other figures from Zeus's romantic history, including Io, Europa, and Leda, whose mortal lives became entangled with divine politics in ways that complicated their posthumous evaluation. Hades developed standardized procedures for handling such cases, establishing precedents that protected the underworld's judicial independence while acknowledging the political realities of divine family relationships. These protocols required extensive documentation of all decisions involving souls connected to other gods, creating a bureaucratic framework that could withstand scrutiny while maintaining consistent application of justice principles. The relationship between Hades and Poseidon developed along different lines, shaped by their shared experience as the middle brothers who had received domains that, while powerful, lacked the central authority that Zeus wielded as king of the gods. Both ruled realms that remained largely separate from the daily activities of most other deities, creating a natural understanding between them about the challenges of governing domains that other gods preferred to avoid contemplating. Poseidon's control over the seas and earthquakes gave him authority over forces that could dramatically affect mortal civilizations, while Hades' dominion over death and underground wealth provided him with influence that touched every aspect of human existence. Their cooperation proved most effective in matters involving the boundaries between their respective domains, particularly in coastal regions where underground rivers connected to ocean systems and where seismic activity could affect the structural integrity of underworld installations. Poseidon's earthquakes occasionally damaged cave systems that served as entry points to the realm of the dead, requiring coordinated repair efforts that utilized both gods' expertise in managing subterranean forces. These collaborative projects strengthened their working relationship while demonstrating how divine cooperation could produce results that neither brother could achieve independently. The two brothers also shared similar temperaments that set them apart from the more gregarious members of the Olympic pantheon. Both preferred solitude to social gatherings, found satisfaction in the systematic management of their domains, and maintained emotional reserves that made them appear aloof or intimidating to other deities. This psychological compatibility allowed them to communicate effectively about administrative challenges and policy decisions without the misunderstandings that often complicated Hades' interactions with more extroverted family members. However, their relationship was not without tensions, particularly regarding matters that affected both maritime and underworld interests. Shipwrecks that resulted in mass casualties created logistical challenges for the underworld's soul processing systems, as large numbers of deaths occurring simultaneously in remote ocean locations required special transportation arrangements and expanded capacity in judgment facilities. Hades occasionally requested that Poseidon moderate his storm activities during periods when the underworld faced administrative backlogs, while Poseidon argued that oceanic weather patterns served essential functions in maintaining global climate balance that took precedence over underworld convenience. The most serious dispute between them arose over the fate of sailors who died at sea and whose bodies were never recovered for proper burial. Traditional underworld procedures required physical death to be confirmed through established protocols before souls could be officially processed, but ocean deaths often left no evidence beyond the absence of individuals who failed to return from voyages. Poseidon maintained that souls lost at sea fell under his jurisdiction until their deaths could be verified, while Hades insisted that all mortal souls ultimately belonged in the underworld, regardless of where or how they died. The resolution of this conflict required the development of new procedures that acknowledge both gods' legitimate interests, while maintaining the cosmic order that depended on clear jurisdictional boundaries. They established a joint commission staffed by representatives from both domains, with sea nymphs serving as liaison officers who could confirm deaths that occurred in oceanic regions and facilitate the transfer of souls to appropriate underworld processing centres. This bureaucratic innovation became a model for resolving similar jurisdictional disputes between other divine authorities. Hades' interactions with his sisters developed along lines that reflected both family loyalty and the practical requirements of maintaining effective working relationships with deities whose domains intersected with his own responsibilities. Hestia, as the goddess of hearth and home, maintained the most cordial relationship with her eldest brother, her gentle nature and domestic focus creating no conflicts with underworld operations, while her role in protecting family unity helped mediate disputes between other siblings. Her temples often served as neutral meeting grounds, where Hades could conduct business with other gods who felt uncomfortable visiting the underworld directly. Hera's relationship with Hades remained complicated by her role as Zeus's wife, and her involvement in the political intrigues that surrounded the king of the gods' numerous extramarital relationships. As queen of the gods, she wielded considerable influence over Olympic society and frequently sought Hades' support for her various schemes to punish Zeus's lovers or their offspring. However, Hades' commitment to impartial justice often put him at odds with Hera's desire for revenge, particularly when her targets were mortal women whose only crime was attracting Zeus's attention. The most significant conflicts arose when Hera's persecution of Zeus's lovers resulted in deaths that brought these women under Hades' jurisdiction. His evaluation of their moral worth typically found them innocent of any serious wrongdoing, making punishment inappropriate regardless of Hera's political motivations. This created tensions between his judicial responsibilities and family loyalty, as supporting Hera's desires would compromise the integrity of underworld justice, while opposing her could strain relationships within the divine family. Demeter's relationship with Hades became permanently altered by the abduction of Persephone, transforming what had been a cordial, if distant, sibling relationship into one characterized by suspicion, resentment, and carefully managed hostility. The goddess of agriculture never fully forgave her brother for the trauma inflicted on her daughter, despite the eventual resolution that allowed Persephone to spend part of each year in the surface world. Demeter's control over crop growth and harvest cycles gave her the power to express her displeasure through agricultural failures that could devastate mortal civilizations, creating pressure on other gods to mediate their ongoing disputes. The practical consequences of this family conflict extended far beyond personal animosity to affect the fundamental operations of both the underworld and the agricultural systems that supported mortal civilization. Demeter's grief and anger during Persephone's absence in the underworld manifested as winter conditions that suspended plant growth and created food shortages that increased mortality rates. These seasonal death spikes strained the underworld's processing capacity, while the reduced agricultural productivity affected the quality and quantity of offerings that mortals could provide to support temple operations. Hades found himself walking a careful line between maintaining his authority as Persephone's husband and acknowledging Demeter's legitimate concerns as a mother whose daughter had been taken without consent. The seasonal arrangement that emerged from their negotiations represented a compromise that satisfied neither party completely, but provided a workable solution that prevented the total breakdown of either agricultural or underworld systems. The annual cycle of Persephone's departure and return created predictable patterns that allowed both domains to plan their operations around the emotional and practical disruptions that these transitions caused. The relationship between Hades and the younger generation of Olympic gods developed according to patterns that reflected both generational differences and the unique challenges that his domain created for social interaction. Athena, as the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, maintained professional respect for Hades' administrative competence and judicial fairness, while avoiding personal relationships that might compromise her reputation for objective analysis. Her visits to the Underworld were strictly business-related, focusing on matters that required coordination between divine domains or consultation about complex legal precedents that affected both mortal and immortal affairs. Apollo's relationship with Hades remained complicated by their opposing associations with life and death, light and darkness, healing and disease. As the god of medicine, music, and prophecy, Apollo represented forces that stood in direct opposition to the endings and finality that characterized the Underworld's fundamental nature. However, his role as a prophet required him to understand and predict death-related events, creating a professional need for accurate information about Underworld policies and procedures. Their interactions typically focused on specific cases where Apollo's healing powers might delay deaths that Hades expected to process, requiring coordination to prevent disruptions in the natural order. The most significant collaboration between them involved the establishment of protocols for handling plague outbreaks and other mass mortality events that could overwhelm both divine domains. Apollo's ability to cause or cure diseases gave him considerable influence over death rates, while Hades' responsibility for processing the resulting souls required advance notice of major health crises to ensure adequate preparation. They developed early warning systems that allowed the Underworld to expand its capacity in anticipation of increased soul traffic, while Apollo agreed to moderate his disease-related interventions to prevent administrative chaos in the realm of the dead. Artemis maintained even greater distance from Hades than her twin brother, her association with wild animals and the hunt creating philosophical conflicts with his role as the ultimate predator who claimed all mortal lives. Her vow of eternal virginity also put her at odds with his marriage to Persephone, as she viewed the abduction as a violation of maiden independence that contradicted her own values about female autonomy. Their interactions remained minimal and formal, limited to situations where her hunting activities affected mortality rates in ways that required underworld attention. The relationship between Hades and Aphrodite reflected the complex dynamics between love and death that had influenced human experience since the beginning of civilization. As the goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite wielded power over the emotional forces that made life worth living, while Hades represented the ultimate ending that gave urgency and meaning to romantic relationships. Their interactions often involved souls whose deaths resulted from love-related conflicts, including murders of passion, suicides caused by unrequited affection, and deaths that occurred during romantic adventures or illicit relationships. Aphrodite's involvement in arranging the circumstances that led to Persephone's abduction created additional complications in their relationship. While Hades appreciated the intervention that had resolved his emotional isolation, he remained aware that his marriage had begun through deception and coercion, rather than the mutual attraction that Aphrodite typically promoted. This knowledge created guilt that affected his interactions with the love goddess, as he recognized that his happiness had been achieved through methods that contradicted her usual emphasis on consensual romantic relationships. Ares maintained a professional relationship with Hades that reflected their shared understanding of death's role in warfare and conflict. As the god of war, Ares was responsible for inspiring the battles that generated many of the souls that passed through underworld judgment, making him one of Hades' most significant business partners in terms of providing raw material for afterlife processing. Their collaboration involved developing efficient systems for handling mass casualties from major battles, including special procedures for warriors who died in combat, and protocols for managing the souls of individuals who died from war-related causes like famine, disease, and displacement. The two gods shared similar reputations as deities whom other immortals preferred to avoid, though for different reasons. Ares inspired fear because of his association with the violence and chaos of warfare, while Hades created discomfort through his connection to death and endings that reminded other gods of concepts they preferred not to contemplate. This mutual understanding of social isolation created a bond between them that transcended their professional relationship, though their different temperaments prevented the development of close friendship. Hephaestus, as the god of metalworking and craftsmanship, maintained the most purely professional relationship with Hades among the younger Olympic deities. His skills in forging weapons and tools made him valuable for creating the specialized equipment that underworld operations required, from the chains used to restrain dangerous souls in Tartarus to the precision instruments needed for conducting judgment procedures. The underground location of many mines and forges created natural overlap between their domains, as Hephaestus often worked in locations that fell technically under Hades' jurisdiction. Their collaboration produced some of the most impressive examples of divine craftsmanship in the ancient world, including the gates that sealed different regions of the underworld and the mechanical systems that regulated the flow of the supernatural rivers. Hephaestus appreciated having a customer who understood the value of quality workmanship and was willing to provide the rare materials necessary for creating items that could function effectively in the supernatural environment of the realm of the dead. The relationship between Hades and various primordial deities reflected the complex hierarchies that had developed since the earliest days of cosmic creation. Nyx, the primordial goddess of night, commanded respect from all younger gods due to her ancient origins and her control over fundamental forces that predated the Olympic order. Her domain overlapped with Hades in the regions where darkness and death intersected, creating opportunities for cooperation while establishing clear boundaries that prevented jurisdictional conflicts. Nyx's children, including Thanatos and Hypnos, work directly within Hades' administrative structure, while maintaining their independent status as primordial forces. Thanatos, as the personification of death itself, served as Hades' primary agent for collecting souls whose deaths required divine intervention or special handling. His ability to appear anywhere in the mortal world at the moment of death made him invaluable for ensuring that no soul escaped proper processing, while his gentle approach to the dying process helped maintain the dignity that death deserved as a natural transition rather than a punishment. Hypnos, the god of sleep, provided essential services that helped maintain the psychological health of underworld residents and staff. His power to induce restful sleep allowed souls undergoing punishment to recover from their ordeals, while his influence over dreams provided opportunities for continued moral education and reflection. The collaboration between sleep and death created natural cycles that prevented the underworld from becoming a place of unrelenting suffering, ensuring that even punishment served rehabilitative purposes rather than mere retribution. The Moirai, or Fates, maintained a complex relationship with Hades that reflected their authority over destiny and the predetermined nature of mortal lifespans. Clotho spun the threads of life, Lachesis measured their length, and Atropos cut them at the appointed time, creating a system that determined when souls would arrive in the underworld regardless of Hades' personal preferences or administrative convenience. Their decisions bound even the gods themselves, making them among the few beings whose authority Hades could not challenge or override. However, the practical implementation of fate required coordination between the Moirai's cosmic planning and the underworld's operational capabilities. Hades needed advance notice of major mortality events to ensure adequate preparation, while the Fates required feedback about processing capacity and resource availability to make informed decisions about timing. This collaboration created a working relationship based on mutual necessity rather than personal affinity, as both parties recognized that cosmic stability depended on their effective coordination. The establishment of the underworld as a functioning realm of divine justice inevitably attracted the attention of mortal heroes whose legendary exploits required them to venture beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. These encounters between living champions and the Lord of the Dead created precedents that would define the relationship between heroic ambition and divine authority for generations to come. Unlike the routine processing of ordinary souls, these interactions involved individuals whose extraordinary abilities and divine patronage allowed them to challenge the fundamental assumptions about mortality and the finality of death itself. The most significant of these encounters began when Eurystheus, king of Tiryns, assigned Heracles his 12th and final labour, the capture of Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guarded the gates of the Underworld. This task represented the ultimate test of heroic capability, requiring not only physical strength and courage, but also the diplomatic skills necessary to negotiate with divine powers whose authority extended beyond mortal comprehension. The assignment reflected both Eurystheus's malicious hope that this impossible task would finally destroy his hated cousin, and the cosmic significance of proving whether mortal heroism could overcome even death itself. Heracles approached this challenge with the methodical preparation that had characterized his previous labours, recognizing that brute force alone would prove inadequate against opponents whose power derived from fundamental cosmic forces rather than mere physical strength. His first step involved seeking initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries, the sacred rites that provided mortals with knowledge about death and the afterlife that would prove essential for navigating the Underworld's complex spiritual landscape. The mysteries revealed the proper protocols for approaching the realm of the dead, the offerings required to gain safe passage, and the psychological preparation necessary to maintain sanity while surrounded by the concentrated essence of mortality itself. The initiation process required Heracles to undergo ritual purification that would cleanse him of the blood guilt accumulated during his previous labours, particularly the killing of the centaurs whose deaths had occurred under circumstances that blurred the line between justified violence and murder. This cleansing proved essential because the Underworld's supernatural environment could detect and react to moral contamination in ways that would make passage dangerous or impossible for individuals carrying unresolved guilt. The purification rituals involved elaborate ceremonies conducted by the most skilled priests, whose expertise in spiritual cleansing had been developed through generations of preparing initiates for contact with divine mysteries. Armed with this sacred knowledge, Heracles descended into the Underworld through the entrance at Cape Taenarum, a location where the boundary between the living and dead worlds remained thin enough to allow passage by those who possessed the proper spiritual preparation. The descent itself required navigating a series of increasingly challenging obstacles that tested both his physical capabilities and his understanding of underworld protocols. The initial passages appeared as natural caves, but their supernatural properties became apparent as the temperature dropped and the air took on the distinctive quality that marked the transition from mortal to immortal realms. The first significant challenge came at the River Styx, where Charon initially refused passage to a living mortal whose presence violated the fundamental assumptions about who belonged in the realm of the dead. The ferryman's objections were not merely procedural, but reflected genuine concern about the disruption that living energy could cause in an environment calibrated for the spiritual essence of deceased souls. Heracles' response demonstrated the diplomatic skills he had developed alongside his legendary strength, as he presented the proper offerings while explaining his mission in terms that acknowledged Charon's authority while asserting his own legitimate need for passage. The negotiation required Heracles to demonstrate both respect for underworld protocols and the divine authorization that made his mission acceptable despite its unprecedented nature. He presented coins minted from gold that had been blessed by multiple Olympic deities, their value enhanced by the sacred nature of his quest rather than the mere monetary worth. More significantly, he carried tokens that proved his initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries, credentials that established his right to travel in the realm of the dead as a living representative of divine will rather than an unauthorized intruder. Charon's eventual agreement to provide passage reflected his recognition that Heracles' mission served purposes that transcended normal underworld operations, though the ferryman insisted on additional precautions to protect his vessel and other passengers from the disruptive effects of living energy. The boat's capacity was reduced to accommodate only Heracles and a minimal crew of specially selected spirits who could tolerate proximity to mortal life force without suffering adverse effects. The crossing proceeded slowly and carefully, with Charon monitoring the supernatural currents that could be disturbed by the presence of someone whose life had not yet reached its appointed conclusion. The journey across the Styx provided Heracles with his first comprehensive view of the underworld's vast scope and complex organization. The river's dark waters reflected images of the various regions that comprised the realm of the dead, from the punishment areas where the wicked endured corrective treatment to the peaceful meadows where ordinary souls spent their eternities in quiet contentment. The sight of so many human spirits, all reduced to the essential elements of their personalities without the physical bodies that had defined their mortal existence, created a profound psychological impact that tested even his legendary courage. The arrival at the underworld's main processing center brought Heracles face to face with the three judges whose authority over the dead had been established since the Cosmic Order's foundation. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus evaluated his request for an audience with Hades himself, their deliberations taking into account both the unprecedented nature of his mission and the potential consequences of allowing a living mortal to penetrate deeper into the realm of death. The judges' decision to grant passage reflected their recognition that divine will, as expressed through the assignment of the 12 labours, took precedence over normal procedural restrictions. The path to Hades' palace led through regions that showcased the full range of afterlife experiences, from the torments of Tartarus to the blissful existence of the Elysian fields. Each area demonstrated different aspects of divine justice and the cosmic balance that the underworld maintained between punishment and reward. Heracles observed the various rehabilitation programs designed to help souls overcome the moral failures that had characterized their earthly lives, while also witnessing the perfect contentment enjoyed by those whose virtue had earned them eternal happiness. The palace itself impressed Heracles with its combination of administrative efficiency and supernatural grandeur, its architecture reflecting both the practical requirements of governing countless souls and the dignity appropriate to a cosmic ruler whose authority extended throughout creation. The throne room, where Hades conducted official business, was carved from a single piece of obsidian that had been shaped by forces operating beyond normal geological processes, its surface polished to mirror perfection while maintaining the light-absorbing properties that created an atmosphere of appropriate solemnity. Hades received Heracles with the formal courtesy, due to a hero whose accomplishments had earned recognition throughout both mortal and divine realms, though his manner made clear that the underworld's authority remained absolute within its designated boundaries. The god's appearance reflected his dual nature as both administrator and cosmic force. His robes woven from darkness itself, while his crown incorporated metals and gems that existed nowhere else in creation. The helm of darkness rested nearby, its presence serving as a subtle reminder of the power that could render even the greatest hero helpless if cooperation proved impossible. The negotiation that followed demonstrated the sophisticated diplomatic protocols that had developed around interactions between divine authority and heroic ambition. Heracles presented his request with proper acknowledgement of Hades' sovereignty, while explaining the cosmic significance of completing the 12 labours as assigned by divine mandate. His argument emphasized that the capture of Cerberus would serve as a test of both heroic capability and divine justice, proving that legitimate achievement could overcome even the most formidable obstacles while respecting the fundamental order that maintained cosmic stability. Hades' response revealed the careful consideration he gave to requests that challenged normal underworld operations while potentially serving broader cosmic purposes. His primary concern focused on maintaining Cerberus's effectiveness as a guardian, while ensuring that the precedent set by this exception would not encourage unauthorized attempts by lesser heroes to breach underworld security. The conditions he established for granting permission reflected both practical security requirements and the symbolic importance of demonstrating that divine authority remained supreme even when accommodating heroic ambitions. The agreement reached between them specified that Heracles could attempt to capture Cerberus using only his natural strength and courage, without weapons or assistance from other heroes or divine powers. This restriction ensured that success would depend entirely on the hero's personal capabilities, rather than external advantages that might diminish the achievement's significance. Additionally, the capture would be temporary, with Cerberus returned to his duties once the labour had been demonstrated to Eurystheus, maintaining the underworld's security while allowing Heracles to complete his assigned task. The encounter with Cerberus itself tested every aspect of Heracles' legendary abilities, as the three-headed hound possessed supernatural strength that matched his own while adding the advantages of multiple sets of teeth, enhanced senses that could detect threats from any direction, and breath that carried the concentrated essence of death itself. The creature's size exceeded that of any mortal animal, his shoulders reaching the height of a normal man while his length stretched across the entire width of the underworld's main entrance. His three heads operated independently, allowing him to track multiple threats simultaneously while coordinating attacks that could overwhelm even the most skilled fighters. The battle required Heracles to develop new fighting techniques that could address the unique challenges presented by an opponent whose anatomy differed fundamentally from any creature he had previously encountered. His strategy focused on neutralizing the hound's advantages through careful positioning and timing, using his superior mobility to avoid the coordinated attacks, while seeking opportunities to apply holds that could control all three heads simultaneously. The struggle continued for hours, both combatants testing the limits of their supernatural endurance while the sound of their conflict echoed throughout the underworld's vast chambers. The resolution came when Heracles managed to secure a grip around Cerberus's necks that prevented the hound from using his breath weapon while limiting the effectiveness of his bite attacks. The hold required the hero to maintain perfect balance and strength distribution, as any weakness would allow the creature to break free and resume his devastating assault. The psychological impact of being restrained proved as significant as the physical constraint, as Cerberus had never experienced defeat in his role as guardian of the dead, his confidence in his own invincibility shaken by the realization that mortal determination could overcome even supernatural advantages. Hades observed this confrontation with professional interest, evaluating both combatants' performance while considering the implications for underworld security and the broader cosmic order. The god's decision to allow the battle to reach its natural conclusion, rather than intervening, reflected his recognition that the outcome would establish important precedents about the relationship between heroic achievement and divine authority. Heracles' victory demonstrated that legitimate heroic action, properly authorized and conducted according to appropriate protocols, could accomplish seemingly impossible tasks without undermining the fundamental structures that maintained cosmic stability. The journey back to the surface world with Cerberus as his captive created additional challenges that tested Heracles' ability to manage supernatural forces beyond his normal experience. The hound's presence in the mortal realm caused disruptions in natural processes as plants withered in response to his breath, while animals fled in terror from the concentrated essence of death that surrounded him. These effects required careful route planning to minimize damage to innocent populations, while ensuring that the demonstration to Eurystheus could proceed according to the labor's requirements. The presentation of Cerberus to Eurystheus achieved its intended effect of proving Heracles' heroic capabilities while simultaneously terrifying the king, whose malicious assignments had been intended to destroy his cousin. The sight of the three-headed guardian of the dead, temporarily subdued but radiating supernatural menace, demonstrated that the hero had successfully penetrated the most secure location in creation and emerged with proof of his achievement. Eurystheus's reaction of hiding in a bronze jar reflected both his cowardice and his recognition that Heracles had transcended normal mortal limitations to achieve something that approached divine status. The return of Cerberus to his duties in the underworld proceeded smoothly, with Hades expressing satisfaction at both the successful completion of the labour and the demonstration that his realm's security remained intact despite the temporary breach. The precedent established by this encounter created protocols for future interactions between heroes and underworld authority, establishing that extraordinary achievements could be recognised and accommodated without compromising the fundamental principles that governed the relationship between life and death. The case of Orpheus presented entirely different challenges that tested Hades' capacity for compassion, while maintaining the inviolable laws that govern the cosmic order. The legendary musician's descent into the underworld following the death of his beloved Eurydice created a situation where personal tragedy intersected with divine justice in ways that required unprecedented consideration of mercy's role in administering the realm of the dead. Unlike Heracles, whose mission served broader cosmic purposes, Orpheus sought purely personal goals that challenged the fundamental assumption that death represented an irreversible transition from one state of existence to another. The circumstances surrounding Eurydice's death had established her as an innocent victim whose fate resulted from the malicious actions of others rather than any moral failing or natural conclusion to a completed life. The attempted assault by Aristeus had forced her to flee through dangerous terrain, where a venomous snake's bite ended her life before she could reach safety or receive assistance. This unjust death created moral complications that standard underworld procedures were not designed to address, as the victim's virtue and the circumstances of her demise suggested that cosmic justice might require exceptional consideration. Orpheus's reputation as a musician whose abilities transcended normal mortal limitations preceded his arrival in the underworld, as reports of his performances had reached even the realm of the dead through the testimony of souls who had witnessed his concerts during their earthly lives. His lyre, crafted by Apollo himself and enhanced with strings that resonated with the fundamental harmonies that governed cosmic order, possessed the power to move even the most hardened hearts and influence emotions in ways that normal music could not achieve. The instrument's supernatural properties made it a tool capable of affecting divine consciousness as well as mortal sensibility. The descent through the underworld's various regions created a musical journey that transformed the very nature of the realm through which Orpheus passed. His songs of love and loss resonated with the experiences of countless souls who had suffered similar tragedies during their mortal lives, creating an atmosphere of shared grief that united the living musician with the dead in recognition of love's universal power to transcend the boundaries between different states of existence. The melody that emerged from his lyre seemed to embody the essence of human longing, its harmonies expressing emotions too profound for words, while its rhythms echoed the heartbeat of life itself. The effect of this music on the underworld's inhabitants proved unprecedented in the realm's long history of operation. Souls who had spent centuries in contemplation of their earthly failures found themselves moved to tears by melodies that reminded them of the love they had experienced before death, separated them from those who had given meaning to their existence. Even the Erinyes, whose nature centered on punishment and justice, paused in their duties as the music awakened memories of the human connections that had motivated the crimes they now worked to correct. Charon, normally implacable in his adherence to established protocols, found his resolve weakened by songs that spoke to the loneliness of his eternal duty, ferrying souls across waters that separated the living from the dead. The ferryman's decision to grant passage without payment reflected not mere sentimentality, but recognition that Orpheus's mission represented something fundamental about the nature of love that transcended normal administrative categories. The music created a temporary suspension of ordinary rules as its power touched aspects of existence that lay deeper than law or custom. The three judges faced their most difficult decision in millennia of service when Orpheus appeared before them to request an audience with Hades himself. The precedent of allowing living mortals to penetrate the underworld's deepest regions had been established by Heracles, but his mission had served cosmic purposes that aligned with divine will. Orpheus sought purely personal goals that challenged the fundamental order that made their judicial system possible, yet his music created emotional responses that suggested his love might represent forces as fundamental as justice itself. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus found themselves unable to reach unanimous agreement about how to proceed. Their normal consensus-building processes disrupted by the conflicting demands of established law and the unprecedented emotional impact of Orpheus's performance. The music seemed to argue more persuasively than any legal brief that love possessed, claims on cosmic justice that had never been adequately considered in the development of underworld protocols. The judges ultimately decided to refer the matter directly to Hades, acknowledging that the issues raised exceeded their authority to resolve. The audience with Hades took place in the throne room where the god conducted his most important business, but the atmosphere differed dramatically from the formal proceedings that normally characterize such meetings. Orpheus's music filled the vast chamber with harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very structure of the palace, creating acoustic effects that transformed the space from an administrative centre into something approaching a concert hall. The obsidian walls reflected and amplified the melodies in ways that created complex harmonic patterns whose beauty exceeded anything previously experienced in the realm of the dead. Persephone's presence during this encounter added emotional complexity that influenced the proceedings in ways that neither participant had anticipated. The queen of the underworld, herself a victim of circumstances beyond her control, recognized elements of her own story in Orpheus's tale of love, separated by forces that seemed to make reunion impossible. Her visible emotional response to the music created pressure on Hades to consider mercy in ways that his role as impartial judge normally precluded, while also providing insight into the psychological impact that rigid adherence to law could have on those affected by its implementation. The performance that Orpheus delivered before the rulers of the dead represented the culmination of his artistic development, as grief and love combined to inspire music that transcended the normal boundaries between mortal and divine expression. His songs told the story of his relationship with Eurydice in melodies that captured not only the joy of their love, but also the devastating impact of its loss, creating an emotional narrative that made their personal tragedy universal in its appeal to anyone who had ever experienced the pain of separation from beloved companions. The music's effect on Hades himself proved the most significant aspect of the entire encounter, as the god found his normally impassive demeanour affected by harmonies that awakened memories of his own isolation and longing before Persephone's arrival had transformed his existence. The recognition of shared experience created empathy that challenged his commitment to impartial administration of cosmic law, while the beauty of the performance suggested that love might represent a force whose claims on justice deserved consideration equal to those of traditional moral categories. The decision to grant Orpheus's request reflected Hades' recognition that exceptional circumstances might require exceptional responses, though the conditions he imposed demonstrated his commitment to maintaining the fundamental principles that govern the cosmic order. Eurydice could return to life, but only if Orpheus could demonstrate the faith and self-control necessary to lead her back to the surface world without looking back to confirm her presence. This test would prove whether his love possessed the strength and purity that could justify overturning the normal finality of death. The condition imposed on Orpheus's success reflected sophisticated understanding of the psychological and spiritual challenges involved in reversing death's effects. The prohibition against looking back served multiple purposes. It tested the musician's faith in divine mercy, demonstrated his ability to trust in forces beyond his direct control, and ensured that the resurrection would depend on spiritual strength rather than mere emotional intensity. The requirement also protected Eurydice from the trauma of experiencing a failed resurrection attempt, as her return to death would be immediate and final if the conditions were violated. The journey back through the underworld's various regions created mounting psychological pressure that tested Orpheus's resolve in ways that his initial descent had not. The knowledge that Eurydice followed behind him, her presence confirmed only by the sound of footsteps that might or might not be real, created doubt that grew stronger with each step toward the surface world. The temptation to look back and confirm her resurrection became overwhelming as they approached the boundary between death and life, where the stakes of success or failure would be finally determined. The tragic failure of Orpheus's mission occurred within sight of the surface world, when his need for confirmation overcame his faith in divine mercy at the crucial moment when success seemed assured. The backward glance that destroyed his hopes created one of mythology's most poignant examples of how human weakness could defeat even divine compassion, while also demonstrating the absolute nature of the laws that govern the relationship between life and death. Eurydice's final disappearance into the shadows established that some opportunities once lost could never be recovered regardless of the love or regret that motivated attempts at redemption. The case of Theseus and Pirithous presented Hades with challenges of an entirely different nature, as their attempted abduction of Persephone represented not tragic love or heroic achievement, but criminal audacity that threatened the fundamental security of the underworld itself. These two heroes, emboldened by their previous successes and convinced of their own invincibility, had conceived a plan that demonstrated complete disregard for divine authority and the cosmic order that maintained stability between mortal and immortal realms. Their scheme to kidnap the Queen of the Dead and force her into marriage with Pirithous revealed the dangerous arrogance that could develop when heroic achievement created inflated confidence in mortal capabilities. The friendship between Theseus and Pirithous had been forged through shared adventures that had convinced both heroes that no challenge exceeded their combined abilities to overcome through courage, strength, and clever planning. Theseus had achieved legendary status through his victory over the Minotaur and his successful navigation of various political and military challenges that had established him as one of Athens' greatest kings. Pirithous had earned similar recognition through his battles with centaurs and his reputation for fearless confrontation of supernatural threats that intimidated lesser heroes. Their decision to seek divine brides reflected both their elevated opinion of their own worth and their failure to understand the fundamental differences between heroic achievement in the mortal realm and the cosmic forces that governed relationships between mortals and gods. The successful abduction of Helen by Theseus had convinced them that even the most protected and valuable women could be claimed through bold action and superior planning, while their victories over various monsters and supernatural threats had created false confidence in their ability to overcome divine opposition through conventional heroic methods. The plan they developed for entering the underworld and seizing Persephone demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the realm's geography and security procedures, though their intelligence proved fatally incomplete regarding the true nature of the forces they intended to challenge. They had learned about the various entrance points, the river systems that provided transportation, and the locations where Persephone might be found during her duties as Queen of the Dead. However, they're mortal. The spiritual landscape of ancient Greece was forever transformed by the emergence of mystery religions that promised initiates direct communion with divine forces governing death and rebirth. Among these sacred traditions, the Eleusinian mysteries stood as the most prestigious and influential, drawing participants from across the Mediterranean world who sought understanding of humanity's ultimate destiny beyond the grave. The cult centred primarily on Demeter and Persephone, with Hades occupying a crucial but carefully circumscribed role as the divine authority whose realm held the keys to eternal salvation or damnation. The sanctuary at Eleusis, located approximately 14 miles northwest of Athens, evolved from a modest agricultural shrine into the ancient world's most important centre for mystery initiation. The site's natural features contributed to its sacred atmosphere, with rolling hills providing seclusion from mundane concerns, while underground chambers created spaces where initiates could experience symbolic journeys into the realm of death. The Telesterion, the great hall where the most sacred rituals took place, could accommodate thousands of participants during the annual festivals that mark the climax of the mystery cycle. The Greater Mysteries, celebrated each autumn during the month of Boedromion, recreated the cosmic drama of Persephone's abduction and returned through elaborate ceremonies that guided initiates through psychological death and spiritual rebirth. The ritual sequence began with purification rites at the Athenian Eleusinion, where participants cleansed themselves in the sea at Phaleron Bay, while holding young pigs that would later be sacrificed to ensure ritual purity. This preliminary phase established the sacred boundary between ordinary existence and the transformative experience that awaited those deemed worthy to receive the mystery's deepest revelations. The procession from Athens to Eleusis along the sacred way created a collective journey that symbolized the soul's passage from mortal concerns toward divine enlightenment. Thousands of initiates, including slaves alongside aristocrats and foreigners alongside citizens, walked the ancient road while carrying sacred objects and chanting hymns that had been transmitted through generations of mystery participants. The democratic nature of initiation, which welcomed all who could speak Greek and had not committed murder, reflected the universal character of death and the hope for blessed afterlife that transcended social distinctions. Hades appeared throughout these ceremonies not as the primary focus of worship, but as the necessary counterpart to Demeter's life-giving power and Persephone's mediating role between Earth and Underworld. The sacred drama portrayed him as the Dark Lord whose realm held terrors for the uninitiated, while offering blessed existence for those who had received proper spiritual preparation. The mysteries taught that death represented not ending but transformation, with Hades serving as the cosmic judge, whose decisions determined whether souls would experience eternal punishment or join the blessed in realms of perpetual joy. The lesser mysteries, celebrated at Agrae near Athens during the spring month of Anthesterion, provided preliminary initiation that prepared participants for the more profound revelations of the autumn ceremonies. These rites focused on purification and moral preparation, with Hades invoked as the divine authority who would ultimately evaluate each soul's worthiness for salvation. Initiates learned the proper prayers and ritual gestures that would ensure safe passage through the underworld's dangers while gaining protection from the various demons and hostile spirits that threatened unprepared souls. The actual content of the mystery revelations remained secret throughout antiquity, protected by religious sanctions that threatened divine punishment for those who revealed sacred knowledge to the uninitiated. However, ancient sources suggest that participants experienced visions of the afterlife's various regions, including glimpses of the Elysian fields where the blessed enjoyed eternal happiness and the punishment areas where the wicked endured corrective suffering. These revelations provided initiates with detailed knowledge of underworld geography and the criteria that determined posthumous destiny. The promise of blessed afterlife offered by the Eleusinian mysteries created a religious framework that transformed ancient attitudes toward death from resignation to hope. Initiates learned that proper preparation during life, combined with the sacred knowledge gained through mystery participation, could ensure favourable treatment in Hades' realm regardless of social status or material wealth. This democratization of salvation challenged traditional beliefs that connected posthumous happiness to earthly success, establishing moral conduct and spiritual preparation as the primary factors determining eternal destiny. Regional variations in Hades' worship throughout the Greek world reflected local traditions and geographical features that influenced how different communities understood and approached the Lord of the Dead. The oracle at Avernus, located near modern Naples in a volcanic region where natural caves descended deep into the earth, became renowned for its direct communication with underworld deities. The site's geography, featuring a dark lake surrounded by sulphurous springs and caverns that seemed to extend infinitely downward, created an atmosphere where the boundary between surface world and realm of the dead appeared particularly thin. Pilgrims travelled from across the Mediterranean to consult the Avernus oracle about the fate of deceased relatives, the proper rituals for ensuring favourable posthumous treatment, and the spiritual preparations necessary for their own eventual deaths. The oracle's pronouncements carried exceptional authority because of the site's apparent direct connection to Hades' realm, with vapours rising from underground sources believed to carry messages from the god himself. The complex rituals required for consultation included elaborate purification ceremonies, expensive sacrifices of black animals, and the presentation of offerings specifically crafted to appeal to underworld deities. The sanctuary at Hermione and the Argolid developed unique practices centered on a sacred grove where cypress trees grew in patterns that locals believed mapped the underworld's geography. Worshippers could walk among these trees while following paths that symbolically recreated journeys through Hades' realm, experiencing controlled encounters with death's mystery while remaining safely within the mortal world. The grove's priests maintained detailed knowledge of underworld topography, providing guidance for visitors who sought understanding of their posthumous destinations or assistance in communicating with deceased family members. Cave sanctuaries throughout Greece and the broader Mediterranean world served as natural temples where the earth itself provided access to Hades' domain. The plutonium at Hierapolis in Asia Minor featured a natural grotto where carbon dioxide emissions from underground sources created a deadly atmosphere that killed birds and small animals while leaving human visitors unharmed if they remained at proper elevations. This phenomenon was interpreted as direct evidence of the underworld's presence beneath the Earth's surface, with the cave serving as a natural gateway where properly prepared individuals could communicate with the dead. The island of Tyneron in Laconia housed one of the most important Hades sanctuaries, built around a cave system that local tradition identified as one of the primary entrances to the underworld. The site's isolation at the southern tip of the Peloponnese enhanced its sacred character, while the dramatic landscape of rocky cliffs and turbulent seas created an appropriately sombre atmosphere for contemplating mortality. Pilgrims who visited Tyneron underwent extensive purification rituals before descending into the cave system, where they participated in ceremonies designed to prepare them for their own eventual journeys to the realm of the dead. Sacred groves dedicated to Hades typically featured plantings of trees and shrubs associated with death and mourning, creating landscapes that evoked the underworld's atmosphere while remaining accessible to living worshippers. Cypress trees, with their dark foliage and association with funeral practices, form the backbone of these sacred spaces, their evergreen nature symbolizing the eternal existence of souls beyond bodily death. Yew trees, whose toxic properties made them symbols of death's power, were planted in patterns that created natural labyrinths where visitors could experience symbolic journeys through the underworld's various regions. Pomegranate trees held special significance in Hades' sacred groves due to their connection with Persephone's story and their symbolic representation of death and rebirth. The fruit's red seeds, hidden within pale flesh, were interpreted as symbols of life persisting within death, while the tree's ability to produce fruit from apparently dead wood during winter months demonstrated nature's capacity for renewal, even under seemingly impossible circumstances. Grove priests maintained these trees with particular care, using their seasonal cycles to time important rituals and their fruit to create offerings that appealed specifically to the Underworld's royal couple. The ritual practices associated with Hades' worship required careful attention to protocols that acknowledged his authority while avoiding actions that might provoke divine anger or interfere with underworld operations. Libations poured onto the ground served as the primary method for communicating with the Lord of the Dead, with participants using specific formulas that identified their intentions while demonstrating proper respect for divine authority. These liquid offerings typically consisted of mixtures that included wine, honey, milk, and water, each component serving specific symbolic functions in establishing communication between mortal and divine realms. The wine used in underworld libations was typically dark and unmixed, its colour echoing the darkness of Hades' realm while its potency demonstrated the seriousness of the worshipper's intentions. Honey provided sweetening that made the offering more appealing while symbolising the preservation of life essence beyond bodily death. Milk represented nurturing and sustenance, acknowledging the underworld's role in caring for souls during their eternal existence, while water served as a purifying agent that cleansed both offering and participant of contamination that might interfere with divine communication. The proper technique for pouring libations required participants to create small depressions in the earth, where liquid could pool and slowly seep downward toward the underground regions where Hades maintained his authority. These ritual holes, called bothros, were carefully constructed to ensure that offerings reached their intended destination, while preventing contamination from surface pollutants. The act of pouring required specific gestures and verbal formulas that identified the participant, stated the purpose of the offering, and requested particular favours or protection from the Lord of the Dead. Sacrificial practices dedicated to Hades emphasized black animals whose colour reflected the darkness of his realm, while their life force provided the spiritual energy necessary for effective communication with underworld deities. Black bulls represented the most prestigious offerings, their size and strength symbolizing the magnitude of requests being made, while their dark coloration created appropriate visual connections to the realm of shadows. The sacrifice of such valuable animals demonstrated the participants' serious commitment to their requests, while providing sufficient spiritual energy to ensure that prayers would reach their divine destination. Black sheep and goats served as more affordable alternatives that remained acceptable to Hades, while allowing participants of modest means to engage in proper worship practices. These animals' association with pastoral life created connections to the natural cycles of death and renewal that governed both agricultural and spiritual existence, while their manageable size made them practical choices for individual or small group ceremonies. The ritual slaughter required specific techniques that ensured rapid, humane death, while preserving the blood that formed the most important component of underworld offerings. The blood from sacrificed animals was collected in specially consecrated vessels and poured into bothros or natural crevices that provided access to underground regions. This crimson liquid was believed to carry the animal's life essence directly to Hades' realm, where it nourished the spirits of the dead while demonstrating the worshipper's willingness to sacrifice valuable resources in exchange for divine favour. The remaining meat was typically burned completely rather than consumed by participants, emphasizing that offerings to the Lord of the Dead belonged exclusively to him and could not be shared with living mortals. Protocols for communicating with deceased family members required additional ritual elements that acknowledged both Hades' authority over the dead and the specific relationships that motivated such attempts at contact. Participants began by obtaining permission from the Lord of the Underworld through appropriate offerings and prayers, establishing their legitimate right to seek communication while demonstrating respect for divine jurisdiction over the deceased. These preliminary rituals often took place at established sanctuaries, where priests could provide guidance and ensure that proper procedures were followed. The actual communication attempts typically occurred at grave sites or other locations with strong connections to the deceased individual, though participants remained required to acknowledge Hades' ultimate authority over all interactions with the dead. Offerings placed at graves included items that had been meaningful to the deceased during life, creating personal connections that facilitated spiritual contact while demonstrating the participants' genuine affection and respect. Food offerings, particularly those featuring the deceased's favourite dishes, provided sustenance for spirits while creating emotional bonds that transcended the boundary between life and death. The evolution of chthonic religious practices reflected changing attitudes toward death and the afterlife, as Greek civilization developed more sophisticated theological and philosophical frameworks for understanding humanity's ultimate destiny. Early practices focused primarily on appeasing potentially dangerous spirits and ensuring that the dead remained properly separated from the living world, with Hades viewed primarily as a distant authority whose realm required careful avoidance rather than active engagement. These primitive approaches emphasized protection and separation rather than the communication and spiritual development that characterized later mystery religions. The development of hero cults created intermediate categories between mortal and divine that influenced how worshippers understood their own potential for posthumous existence. Heroes who had achieved semi-divine status through exceptional deeds during life provided models for transcending ordinary mortality while remaining subject to Hades' ultimate authority. These figures served as intermediaries who could advocate for living worshippers while providing examples of how proper conduct and spiritual preparation could lead a blessed afterlife rather than mere survival in shadowy underworld regions. Philosophical schools, particularly those influenced by Pythagorean and Orphic teachings, developed sophisticated doctrines about soul purification and spiritual development that transformed chthonic worship from simple appeasement into active preparation for posthumous existence. These intellectual frameworks provided theoretical foundations for mystery religions while creating systematic approaches to moral development that promised initiates favourable treatment in Hades' realm. The integration of philosophical and religious elements created hybrid practices that appealed to educated participants while maintaining the emotional power that made mystery initiation psychologically transformative. The influence of chthonic religious practices on later Roman interpretations of underworld deities demonstrated the cultural continuity that connected Greek and Roman approaches to death and afterlife, while highlighting the adaptations that occurred as these beliefs spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Roman adoption of Greek mystery religions preserved essential elements while modifying practices to accommodate different legal frameworks and social structures. The Roman emphasis on practical benefits and civic responsibility influenced how underworld worship developed in ways that emphasized the connection between proper religious observance and social stability. Roman mystery cults maintained the essential structure of Greek initiation, while adapting ceremonial elements to reflect Roman values and administrative preferences. The Eleusinian mysteries continued to operate under Roman rule, attracting participants from throughout the empire who sought the same spiritual benefits that had drawn Greek initiates for centuries. However, Roman authorities imposed regulatory frameworks that ensured mystery practices remained compatible with imperial religious policies, while preventing the development of potentially subversive secret societies. The Roman identification of Hades with Pluto emphasized the wealth-giving aspects of his divine nature, while maintaining recognition of his authority over death and judgment. This adaptation reflected Roman pragmatic approaches to religion that valued deities' practical benefits for human society, while acknowledging their cosmic significance. The development of Pluto worship in Roman contexts created new ceremonial forms that celebrated underground wealth while preserving the essential elements of death-related ritual that connected worshippers to fundamental questions about human destiny and divine justice. The Roman conquest of Greece in 146 BC initiated a profound transformation in how the ancient world understood and worshipped the Lord of the Underworld. Roman religious sensibilities, shaped by centuries of practical governance and territorial expansion, approached divine authority through fundamentally different lenses than their Greek predecessors. Where Greek theology emphasized the mysterious and often terrifying aspects of death's inevitability, Roman interpretations focused on the tangible benefits that divine favor could provide to both individuals and the state. This shift in perspective transformed Hades from a distant, fearsome ruler of the dead into Pluto, a deity whose underground dominion represented vast wealth and prosperity, waiting to be discovered by those who properly honoured his authority. The etymological evolution from Hades to Pluto reflected this changing emphasis with remarkable precision. The Greek name Hades, derived from Idoneus, meaning the unseen one, emphasized the god's invisible presence and the hidden nature of his realm. Roman adoption of the epithet Pluto, meaning the wealthy one, fundamentally altered the deity's public image by highlighting his control over precious metals, gems, and fertile soil, rather than his role as judge of the dead. This linguistic transformation accompanied broader changes in religious practice that made underworld worship more accessible to ordinary citizens, while maintaining the essential theological framework that governed relationships between mortals and chthonic powers. Roman religious administrators, renowned for their systematic approach to incorporating foreign deities into state-sponsored worship, recognized that Hades' Greek associations with death and judgment could serve imperial interests if properly channeled through institutional structures. The god's authority over mineral wealth aligned perfectly with Roman economic priorities, as the empire's expansion depended heavily on access to gold, silver, copper and iron deposits that lay beneath conquered territories. Military campaigns often targeted regions known for their mineral resources, making Pluto's favour essential for sustaining the economic foundations that supported Roman military and administrative operations. The Roman Senate formally recognised Pluto's importance through legislation that established state-funded temples and appointed official priests responsible for maintaining proper relationships with the god who controlled the empire's underground wealth. These appointments carried significant political weight, as the priests' pronouncements about divine favour could influence imperial mining policies, military campaigns targeting mineral-rich regions, and the allocation of resources for infrastructure projects that required extensive excavation. The integration of Pluto worship into state religion created new categories of religious authority that connected spiritual practice directly to economic and political decision-making. The first major temple dedicated to Pluto and Persephone in Rome was constructed during the early 3rd century BC, following a series of earthquakes that had damaged existing religious structures while revealing new underground chambers that seemed to provide direct access to the god's realm. The temple's location on the Campus Martius reflected careful consideration of both practical and symbolic factors, as the site's elevation provided excellent drainage for the underground chambers that form the temple's most distinctive architectural feature, while its proximity to the Tiber River created natural connections to the water sources that linked surface and subterranean regions. The architectural design incorporated innovative engineering techniques that allowed worshippers to descend into elaborately decorated underground chambers where the boundary between mortal and divine realms seemed to dissolve. These subterranean spaces featured walls lined with the finest examples of marble, porphyry, and other precious stones that demonstrated Pluto's generosity to those who properly honoured his authority. The chambers were illuminated by oil lamps that burned continuously, their flames fed by natural gas seepage that provided evidence of the god's presence beneath the temple's foundations. The temple's above-ground structures emphasized the wealth-giving aspects of Pluto's nature through decorative programs that celebrated the abundance available to those who earned divine favor. Sculptural reliefs depicted scenes of successful mining operations, bountiful harvests emerging from fertile soil, and the presentation of precious offerings to the god and goddess whose underground palace provided the ultimate source of earthly prosperity. These artistic programs served both religious and educational functions, teaching visitors about proper worship practices while demonstrating the practical benefits that could result from maintaining good relationships with chthonic deities. The priesthood established to serve this temple developed elaborate ritual cycles that coordinated agricultural and mining activities with celestial events and seasonal changes that influenced underground conditions. The priests maintained detailed records of successful and unsuccessful mining ventures throughout the empire, correlating these outcomes with the quality and timing of offerings made to Pluto. This systematic approach to divine-human relationships reflected Roman administrative preferences while creating practical frameworks for maximizing the economic benefits that could be derived from proper religious observance. Proserpina's role in Roman temple worship evolved to emphasize her function as a mediator between surface and underground realms rather than focusing primarily on her status as an abducted bride. Roman interpretations portrayed her as a willing partner in governing the underworld's vast resources, her seasonal movements between realms serving as a divine model for the cyclical processes that governed both agricultural productivity and mineral extraction. This theological reframing reduced the emphasis on trauma and coercion that had characterized Greek versions of her story, creating a more positive narrative that aligned with Roman preferences for depicting divine relationships as partnerships that served cosmic order. The ritual calendar developed for the Roman temple complex coordinated Pluto and Proserpina worship with the practical requirements of agricultural and mining operations throughout the empire. Spring ceremonies celebrated Proserpina's return from the underworld, with festivals that blessed seed planting and the opening of new mining shafts, while autumn observances marked her descent with rituals that protected stored grain and ensured the safety of miners working in deep excavations during winter months. These seasonal celebrations created community-wide events that reinforced social solidarity while providing practical guidance for economic activities that depended on divine favour. The integration of mystery elements into Roman temple worship required careful adaptation of Greek initiation practices to accommodate Roman legal and social structures. Roman law prohibited secret societies that might threaten state security, requiring mystery cults to operate under official supervision while maintaining the essential elements that made initiation psychologically and spiritually transformative. The solution involved creating graduated levels of temple membership that provided increasingly profound religious experiences without establishing autonomous organizations that could challenge imperial authority. The Roman approach to mystery initiation emphasized practical preparation for posthumous existence, rather than the ecstatic experiences that had characterized many Greek practices. Initiates learned detailed information about underworld geography, the criteria used for judging souls, and the specific prayers and offerings that could ensure favorable treatment after death. This educational approach reflected Roman preferences for systematic knowledge and practical preparation, creating religious experiences that provided concrete benefits while satisfying spiritual needs for transcendence and meaning. The literary transformation of Hades into Pluto reached its most sophisticated expression in the works of Roman poets, who adapted Greek mythological traditions to serve contemporary cultural and political needs. Ovid's Metamorphoses presented the most influential Roman interpretation of the Pluto-Proserpina story, reimagining the abduction narrative in ways that emphasized transformation and renewal, rather than violence and trauma. His version portrayed Pluto as a lonely ruler whose love for Proserpina brought life and beauty to the underworld, while her presence transformed the realm of the dead into a place where growth and change remained possible even after mortal existence had ended. Ovid's treatment of the underworld emphasized its role as a place of transformation, where souls could continue their development rather than simply enduring eternal punishment or reward. This interpretation aligned with Roman legal concepts that emphasized rehabilitation and social utility rather than pure retribution, creating theological frameworks that supported imperial policies aimed at integrating diverse populations into unified social structures. The poets' descriptions of underworld regions portrayed them as organized communities where souls contributed to collective welfare according to their abilities and moral development. The influence of Ovid's version extended throughout Roman literary culture, inspiring subsequent poets and prose writers to develop increasingly sophisticated treatments of underworld themes that served both entertainment and educational functions. These literary works provided detailed descriptions of afterlife geography and social organization that helped ordinary citizens understand what awaited them after death, while reinforcing moral standards that supported social stability. The popularity of such literature demonstrated how Roman culture successfully integrated religious and secular concerns through artistic expressions that served multiple social functions. Virgil's Aeneid presented perhaps the most politically significant Roman interpretation of underworld themes, using Aeneas's journey through the realm of the dead to legitimize imperial authority, while providing detailed descriptions of posthumous justice that reinforced Roman moral and social values. The epic's underworld scenes depicted Pluto as a just ruler whose authority supported the cosmic order that made Roman civilization possible, while the various regions of his realm demonstrated how divine justice operated according to principles that paralleled Roman legal and administrative systems. The Aeneid's influence on Roman religious thought extended far beyond its literary merits, as the epic became required reading for educated citizens throughout the empire. Virgil's descriptions of underworld organization provided authoritative accounts of posthumous existence that influenced how Romans understood their own moral obligations and civic responsibilities. The poet's portrayal of heroes and villains receiving appropriate rewards and punishments created powerful incentives for behavior that supported imperial stability, while discouraging actions that threatened social order. Seneca's dramatic works contributed another dimension to Roman underworld literature through tragedies that explored the psychological and moral implications of death and judgment. His plays presented Pluto and Proserpina as complex characters whose decisions about posthumous fate reflected sophisticated understanding of human nature and the circumstances that influence moral behavior during life. These dramatic treatments provided emotional frameworks for understanding death and judgment that complemented the more systematic approaches found in religious and philosophical texts. The integration of Pluto worship into Roman state religion created new categories of religious authority that connected spiritual practice directly to imperial administration. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, assumed ultimate responsibility for maintaining proper relationships with all deities, including those whose domains extended beyond the visible world. This centralization of religious authority ensured that underworld worship served imperial interests while maintaining the theological integrity that made such practices spiritually meaningful for individual participants. The development of imperial cult practices created additional connections between underworld worship and political authority through ceremonies that honored deceased emperors who had achieved divine status. These observances required coordination between traditional Pluto worship and the newer practices that celebrated imperial divinity, creating complex ritual frameworks that acknowledge both ancient religious traditions and contemporary political realities. The successful integration of these elements demonstrated Roman administrative skill while reinforcing the legitimacy of imperial authority through religious sanction. Provincial variations in Pluto worship throughout the Roman Empire reflected local traditions and geographical features, while maintaining essential elements that connected regional practices to imperial religious policies. Mining regions developed particularly elaborate ceremonies that celebrated the god's generosity in revealing underground wealth, while agricultural areas emphasized his role in ensuring soil fertility and protecting stored grain. These local adaptations created diverse expressions of unified religious concepts, demonstrating how Roman administrative flexibility could accommodate cultural diversity while maintaining political coherence. The construction of temples dedicated to Pluto and Proserpina in major provincial cities created networks of religious authority that reinforced imperial administrative structures while providing local populations with access to the spiritual benefits that proper underworld worship could provide. These buildings served multiple functions as religious centres, community gathering places, and symbols of imperial presence that reminded local populations of their integration into larger political and cultural systems. The architectural styles developed for these temples combined Roman engineering techniques with local decorative traditions, creating distinctive regional variations that maintained connection to imperial standards. The transformation of Hades from his original Greek conception to the Roman Pluto represented only the beginning of a cultural evolution that would continue for millennia, as successive civilizations reinterpreted the ancient Lord of the Underworld to serve their own spiritual, artistic, and philosophical needs. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD did not diminish the cultural significance of underworld mythology, but rather created new opportunities for Christian theologians and medieval scholars to incorporate classical traditions into emerging religious frameworks that sought to explain humanity's relationship with death, judgment, and eternal destiny. Medieval Christian scholars faced the complex challenge of reconciling classical mythology with monotheistic theology, requiring sophisticated interpretative strategies that could acknowledge the cultural value of ancient traditions while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy. The solution involved transforming pagan deities into allegorical figures that represented moral and spiritual concepts, rather than independent divine entities. Hades became a symbol of humanity's fallen nature and the spiritual darkness that separation from divine grace created, while his realm provided a classical framework for understanding the Christian concept of hell as a place of punishment for the unrepentant. The most influential Christian reinterpretation of underworld mythology emerged in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, completed around 1320. This monumental work transformed the classical underworld into a comprehensive Christian cosmology that incorporated Greek and Roman mythological elements while serving the theological purposes of medieval Christianity. Dante's Inferno presented a systematic geography of damnation that drew heavily on classical descriptions of Hades' realm, while adapting these traditions to reflect Christian moral categories and eschatological beliefs. Dante's version of the underworld retained the geographical features that had characterized ancient descriptions, including the rivers that separated different regions and the various levels that housed souls according to their moral classifications. However, the poet transformed these classical elements to serve Christian theological purposes, with the river Styx becoming a barrier that separated the merely unfortunate from the truly damned, while the classical judges were replaced by Minos, who assigned souls to appropriate circles of hell based on Christian rather than pagan moral standards. The figure of Charon underwent similar transformation in Dante's hands, retaining his function as ferryman while serving Christian rather than classical religious purposes. The poet's description emphasized the figure's role in divine justice rather than mere transportation, portraying him as an agent of God's will who ensured that souls reached their appropriate destinations according to divine judgment rather than arbitrary fate. This reinterpretation maintained the psychological impact of the classical figure while adapting his function to serve monotheistic, rather than polytheistic, theological frameworks. Dante's treatment of classical mythological figures throughout the Inferno demonstrated how medieval Christian culture could incorporate pagan traditions without compromising religious orthodoxy. Figures like the Minotaur, the Centaurs, and the Harpies retained their classical characteristics while serving as symbols of specific sins rather than independent supernatural entities. This allegorical approach allowed Christian readers to appreciate classical literary traditions while interpreting them through theological lenses that reinforced rather than challenged their religious beliefs. The influence of Dante's work on subsequent European culture cannot be overstated, as the Divine Comedy became one of the most widely read and influential texts in Western literature. The poem's detailed descriptions of underworld geography and its systematic categorization of sins and punishments provided frameworks that influenced European art, literature, and theology for centuries. Artists drew inspiration from Dante's vivid imagery, while theologians found in his work sophisticated treatments of moral and spiritual questions that complemented official church doctrine. The Renaissance period witnessed a renewed interest in classical mythology that created new opportunities for artistic and literary treatments of Hades and his realm. Humanist scholars, working to recover and interpret ancient texts, developed more historically accurate understandings of Greek and Roman religious beliefs while creating new artistic works that celebrated classical themes. This cultural movement produced some of the most memorable artistic representations of underworld mythology, as painters, sculptors, and writers found in these ancient stories rich sources of inspiration for exploring universal human concerns about death, love, and moral responsibility. Renaissance artists approached classical underworld themes with technical skills and artistic sensibilities that surpassed their medieval predecessors, creating works that captured both the terror and beauty that ancient sources had attributed to Hades' realm. Sandro Botticelli's illustrations for Dante's Divine Comedy demonstrated how Renaissance artistic techniques could bring new life to medieval interpretations of classical themes, while his other works showed how pagan mythological subjects could be treated with the same seriousness and artistic sophistication that had previously been reserved for Christian themes. The story of Hades and Persephone proved particularly attractive to Renaissance artists, who found in this myth rich opportunities for exploring themes of love, loss, and transformation that resonated with contemporary concerns about human relationships and spiritual development. Gian Lorenzo Bernini's sculpture The Rape of Proserpina, completed between 1621 and 1622, captured the dramatic moment of abduction with unprecedented technical virtuosity, his marble figures displaying emotional intensity and physical realism that brought new psychological depth to the ancient story. Bernini's treatment of the myth emphasized the human emotions involved in the divine drama, with Proserpina's terror and Pluto's determination rendered in marble with such skill that viewers could almost hear her cries and feel his grip. The sculpture's technical achievements in depicting different textures, from soft flesh to flowing drapery to Cerberus's fur, demonstrated how Renaissance artistic techniques could serve classical themes while creating works that spoke to contemporary audiences about timeless human experiences. The development of opera during the late Renaissance and early Baroque periods created new opportunities for musical treatments of classical underworld themes. Claudio Monteverdi's L'Orfeo, premiered in 1607, established opera as a serious artistic medium, while demonstrating how classical myths could provide frameworks for exploring universal human emotions through the combined power of music, drama, and visual spectacle. The opera's treatment of Orpheus's journey to the underworld created musical representations of different emotional states and spiritual conditions that influenced subsequent operatic traditions. Monteverdi's musical characterization of Pluto portrayed the god as a figure of terrible authority, whose power over death created both fear and respect among mortals and immortals alike. The composer's use of deep bass voices and dark orchestral colours created musical representations of the underworld's atmosphere, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to a cosmic ruler whose decisions affected the ultimate destiny of every soul. This musical interpretation influenced how later composers approached similar themes, establishing conventions that connected musical elements to mythological concepts. Christoph Willibald Gluck's Orfeo ed Eurydice, premiered in 1762, represented the culmination of operatic treatments of classical underworld themes during the 18th century. Gluck's reform opera simplified the dramatic structure while intensifying the emotional impact, creating a work that focused on the essential human drama rather than elaborate mythological details. His musical treatment of the underworld scenes emphasized the contrast between the realm of the dead and the world of the living through orchestral techniques that created distinct atmospheric effects for each environment. The Romantic period of the 19th century brought new, psychological interpretations of classical mythology that emphasized individual emotional experience over collective cultural meaning. Romantic artists and writers found in the figure of Hades a symbol of the dark, mysterious aspects of human consciousness that rational Enlightenment thought had sought to suppress or explain away. This psychological approach to mythological interpretation created new artistic works that used classical themes to explore contemporary concerns about the relationship between conscious and unconscious mental processes. The emergence of psychology as a scientific discipline during the late 19th and early 20th centuries provided new frameworks for interpreting classical mythology that emphasized universal patterns in human mental development rather than specific cultural or religious meanings. Carl Jung's analytical psychology proved particularly influential in reinterpreting mythological figures as archetypes that represented fundamental aspects of human psychological structure rather than external supernatural entities. Jung's analysis of Hades emphasized the god's role as an archetype of the unconscious mind, the hidden realm where repressed memories, primitive instincts, and transformative psychological processes operated beyond conscious awareness. This interpretation portrayed the underworld as a psychological rather than geographical space, where individuals could encounter aspects of themselves that normal consciousness preferred to avoid or deny. The journey to Hades' realm became a metaphor for psychological exploration and integration, rather than literal travel to a supernatural destination. The Jungian interpretation of Persephone's abduction transformed the myth from a story about divine marriage into an allegory of psychological development, with the young goddess representing the innocent consciousness that must descend into unconscious depths to achieve psychological maturity and integration. Her seasonal movements between surface and underworld symbolized the cyclical nature of psychological growth, which required periodic retreats into unconscious exploration, followed by returns to conscious activity enriched by deeper self-understanding. This psychological approach to classical mythology influenced numerous 20th century artists, writers, and filmmakers who found in ancient stories frameworks for exploring contemporary concerns about identity, mental health, and personal transformation. The interpretation of mythological journeys as psychological processes rather than literal adventures created new possibilities for artistic expression that could address modern audiences' concerns while maintaining connection to cultural traditions that had provided meaning and guidance for thousands of years. Contemporary literature has continued to find inspiration in the figure of Hades and his realm, with authors adapting classical themes to address modern concerns about death, relationships, and social justice. Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series introduced Hades to new generations of readers through young adult novels that portrayed classical gods as continuing participants in contemporary American life. Riordan's version of Hades maintained the god's essential characteristics while adapting his personality and concerns to reflect modern sensibilities about authority, family relationships, and social responsibility. Madeline Miller's Circe and other contemporary novels have reimagined classical mythology from female perspectives, offering new interpretations of familiar stories that emphasize previously marginalized voices and experiences. These works often portray Hades as a more complex figure than traditional sources suggested, exploring his motivations and emotional life in ways that create greater sympathy for his position, while maintaining acknowledgement of the problematic aspects of his relationship with Persephone. The film industry has produced numerous adaptations of classical underworld themes, from Disney's animated Hercules, which portrayed Hades as a comedic villain, to more serious treatments like Clash of the Titans and its sequel, which emphasized the gods' role in cosmic conflicts between different generations of deities. These cinematic interpretations have introduced classical mythology to global audiences, while adapting ancient themes to serve contemporary entertainment preferences and moral sensibilities. Video games have created interactive experiences that allow players to explore virtual versions of the classical underworld, while engaging with mythological themes through gameplay rather than passive consumption. Games like Hades by Supergiant Games have received critical acclaim for their sophisticated treatments of classical mythology, creating narratives that respect ancient sources while adapting them for interactive media that requires player agency and choice. The persistence of Hades and underworld mythology in contemporary culture demonstrates the enduring relevance of these ancient stories for addressing fundamental human concerns that transcend specific historical periods or cultural contexts. Modern audiences continue to find meaning in myths that explore death, judgment, love, loss, and transformation because these themes remain central to human experience regardless of technological advancement or social change. The figure of Hades has evolved from an ancient Greek god of the dead to a cultural symbol that represents humanity's ongoing struggle to understand mortality, justice, and the possibility of meaning beyond individual existence. His story continues to inspire artistic creation, psychological insight, and spiritual reflection because it addresses questions that every human culture must confront about the nature of life, death, and what, if anything, lies beyond. The legacy of Hades extends beyond entertainment and artistic inspiration to influence contemporary discussions about death, dying, and end-of-life care in modern societies. The ancient emphasis on proper preparation for death and the importance of moral conduct during life continues to resonate in secular and religious contexts that seek to help individuals face mortality with dignity and purpose. The classical tradition's recognition that death represents transformation rather than mere ending provides frameworks for understanding grief, loss, and the continuation of memory and influence beyond physical existence. As humanity continues to grapple with fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and destiny, the ancient figure of Hades remains relevant as a symbol of the mysterious forces that govern human life and death. His evolution from feared god of the dead to complex literary and psychological archetype demonstrates how cultural traditions can adapt and survive across millennia, providing continuity and wisdom that connect contemporary experience to the accumulated insights of countless previous generations who face the same ultimate questions about mortality and meaning that define the human condition.